Here is what nobody tells you about lost cities. They were not lost. That is the part that gets left out of every breathless documentary, every ancient mystery revealed thumbnail, every episode of a show where a man in a khaki shirt stares meaningfully at rubble. The people who lived in these cities knew exactly where they were. They walked their streets every morning. They complained about the price of grain. They argued with their neighbors over property lines. They had opinions about local politics. They buried their dead and raised their children and fell asleep to the same sounds every night, the sounds of a city that was, to them, simply home. What happened to those cities is not a mystery of location. It is a mystery of continuity. Somewhere between then and now, the thread was cut. The memory was swallowed. The name was forgotten or corrupted or buried under 17 feet of silt, and then, centuries later, a confused European with a shovel found a wall and started asking questions. The lost cities of the ancient world are not lost because they vanished. They are lost because we forgot them. And that distinction matters because what we are really talking about when we talk about these places is not archaeology. It is memory. What gets remembered? What gets erased? Who decides and why? Tonight, over the course of the next several hours, you are going to visit 10 cities that the ancient world built, loved, used, and eventually forgot. Some of them you have heard of. Some of them you almost certainly have not. All of them will tell you something true about how civilizations rise and what happens when the specific combination of circumstances that made them possible quietly dissolves. We are going to Carthage, the city that Rome was so afraid of it had to be obliterated from the earth and then spent 3 centuries lying about why. We are going to the Sumerian city so old it makes ancient Rome look like a new development. We are going to Teotihuacan, the largest city in the Western Hemisphere for centuries, whose actual name we still do not know. We are going to Mohenjo-daro, the Bronze Age metropolis with better plumbing than most of Victorian London. We are going to Palmyra, the city that sat at the crossroads of every empire and somehow charmed all of them until one empire finally decided it was done being charmed. We are going to Çatalhöyük, the Neolithic proto-city that turns almost everything you think you know about how civilization began completely upside down. We are going to Cahokia, the city that existed in what is now the American Midwest, that at its peak was larger than contemporary London, and that almost nobody in the United States has ever heard of. We are going to Akrotiri, the Aegean city that a volcanic eruption buried so completely and so quickly that the bread was still in the ovens when archaeologists found it 3,000 years later. We are going to Angkor, the Khmer capital that once housed 1 million people in the jungle and then just, somehow, gradually stopped. And we are going to Babylon, which you think you know, but you do not really, not the actual one. 10 cities, 10 stories. And running through all of them, like a thread you will start to notice once you know to look, one single uncomfortable truth about what cities actually are, what they actually need to survive, and why the fact that any of them lasted at all is the real miracle. If this is your first time here, welcome to the quiet past. If you have been here before, you know how this works. Get comfortable. We are going to be here a while. A word before we begin this channel exists because of you. Specifically because of the comments, the subscriptions, the people who share these videos with a friend and say, "Put this on, you will not regret it." If you are watching this and you are not subscribed, the button is right there and it is free and it genuinely helps. If you have been watching for a while and you have never left a comment, tonight is a good night to start. Tell me which of these 10 cities you already knew about and which one surprised you. That is a real question, not a rhetorical one. The answers are always more interesting than I expect. Now, Let us begin. The city the world forgot to remember, Ur of the Chaldees, southern Mesopotamia, circa 3800 BCE to 500 BCE. Tonight, you are standing in a desert. There is nothing in any direction except flat, yellow-brown earth baking under a sun that feels genuinely personal, like it has decided to make an example of you specifically. The air smells like dust and something faintly vegetal, the ghost of reeds from the river delta, the Euphrates and Tigris braiding and unbraiding themselves somewhere to the east. There are no landmarks, there is no shade. If you arrived here without being told what you were looking at, you would turn around and leave. But you were told. You are standing in what was, for centuries, one of the most important cities on earth. You are standing in Ur. Not the biblical Ur of the Chaldees, although yes, that too, we will get to that. You are standing in the real Ur, the Sumerian Ur, the city that was already more than 1,000 years old when Abraham was supposedly born here. The city that had streets and sewers and temples and a ziggurat you could see from 50 miles away. The city that had a school system. The city whose scribes wrote down so much of their daily life on clay tablets that we can tell you what a student complained about on a Tuesday in approximately 1750 BCE. We know what the student's mother packed for his lunch. We know what his teacher said to him when he arrived late. We know the homework he failed to complete. We know all of this. And still, for most of recorded Western history, Ur was a word in a book, a name in the Bible, a location no one was entirely sure was real. That is where we start, with the question of why. The deep history. To understand what Ur was, you need to first understand what southern Mesopotamia was, and to understand that, you need to reset your internal timeline considerably. We tend to think of civilization as a relatively recent development. The Greeks, the Romans, maybe the Egyptians if we are feeling generous, that is usually where the mental clock starts. But the world where Ur flourished was so old that it makes the Greeks look like newcomers who just moved into the neighborhood. When Plato was writing about ideal cities, Ur had already been a major urban center for 2,000 years. 2,000 years before Plato, there was already a city here with a population that scholars estimate at somewhere between 65,000 and 100,000 people, all of them living in a metropolitan area of roughly 150 acres, all of them operating within a sophisticated bureaucratic, religious, and commercial framework that had been evolving for generations. This was not primitive. This was not people squatting in mud huts. This was a functioning, complex, literate society with an economy and a legal system, and a professional class of scribes and administrators and priests, who spent their careers doing what professional scribes and administrators and priests have always done, which is managing information, enforcing rules, and arguing about precedent. The Sumerians who built Ur were not the first people in southern Mesopotamia, but they were the first to leave the kind of evidence that allows historians to reconstruct their world with any real confidence. And what they left is staggering. The clay tablets alone, hundreds of thousands of them recovered from sites across the region, contain everything from royal proclamations to grocery lists, from hymns to the gods to passive-aggressive letters from merchants to their business partners. One of the most famous Sumerian texts ever recovered, a clay tablet from around 1750 BCE, is a letter from a copper merchant named Nasir to a customer named Nani, and it is essentially the world's first customer complaint letter. Nani is furious about the quality of the copper he received. He describes it as substandard. He says he was treated disrespectfully by Nasir's agents. He says he intends to pursue the matter further. The tablet is about 3,500 years old, and it reads with the exact same energy as a one-star Amazon review. These were people, not myths, people. The city itself, in its prime, was built around three essential features. First, the Euphrates River, which at that time ran much closer to the city than it does now, millennia of silt deposition having shifted the course considerably. The river was life. It was transport, irrigation, fish, reeds for building, clay for tablets and bricks. Without the river, there was no Second, the harbor, because was a trading city and the harbor was its engine. Goods came in from the Persian Gulf, from what is now India, from the stone-poor but resource-hungry cities of the Mesopotamian interior. Copper from Oman, carnelian from the Indus Valley, timber from Lebanon, grain from the surrounding agricultural hinterland. Third, and most visibly, the ziggurat of Namu, the ziggurat of If you know one thing about it is probably this. The ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid of mud brick, was the physical and spiritual center of the city. It was built, or more precisely rebuilt in its current form, by the king Namu around 2100 BCE, and it was dedicated to the moon god Nana, who was the patron deity of Nana's temple sat at the very top, and the whole structure rose approximately 30 meters, roughly 100 feet above the flat plain of southern Mesopotamia, visible from an enormous distance in every direction. Here is the thing about the ziggurat that the pictures do not quite convey. It was not just a monument. It was a piece of functioning religious infrastructure. Priests went up and down those stairs every day. Offerings were made. Ceremonies were performed. The economic and administrative life of the city was organized around the temple complex at its base. The ziggurat was not decorative flourish. It was operating center. The city surrounding it was a proper urban grid, more or less, though perhaps not as regular as that phrase implies. Streets ran between blocks of mud brick houses, some of which were 2 stories tall. The houses of the wealthier citizens had central courtyards, a design that would remain common in the region for millennia, the central courtyard providing light, ventilation, and a degree of privacy that a city this dense absolutely required. There were public buildings, administrative offices, storage facilities, workshops where craftsmen worked copper and gold and textiles. There were taverns. We know there were taverns because we have the regulations governing them, including the rule that a tavern keeper who served watered-down beer could be executed. The Sumerians were not messing around about beer. There were schools. The Adaba, or tablet house, was where young men and occasionally young women learned to read and write cuneiform. The curriculum was demanding. Students copied tablets, memorized lists of words and signs, learned mathematics. Some of the tablets they produced still exist, including the homework tablets with the teachers' corrections still on them, and they tell a story of education that is both startlingly familiar and completely alien. Familiar because the students were bored and sometimes made careless errors and sometimes clearly did not do the reading. Alien because the reading was hymns to Inanna and king lists stretching back to before the flood. The flood. Yes, that flood. We will come back to that. The Royal Cemetery in the 1920s and 1930s, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley excavated under the auspices of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, and what he found in the cemetery changed the way the world thought about ancient Mesopotamia. Woolley was a careful, methodical excavator for his era, and his era was one where careful and methodical had a fairly wide definition, but he documented what he found with enough precision that his records remain foundational. The royal cemetery of Ur contained hundreds of graves, ranging from simple burials to elaborate tomb chambers of remarkable wealth. Woolley found jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship, gold headdresses, lapis lazuli and carnelian necklaces, silver vessels, musical instruments including the famous bull-headed lyre whose golden bull's head stared up at him from the dirt as if it had just been waiting. He found the standard of Ur, a wooden box inlaid with shell, lapis lazuli and red limestone, depicting scenes of war and peace in 2 registers that remain among the most vivid windows we have into early Sumerian court life. On the war side, soldiers march in formation, chariots roll over the bodies of enemies, prisoners are presented to a king. On the peace side, a feast is in progress. A musician plays, people drink. The king sits on a throne. All of it rendered in miniature detail, all of it preserved underground for 4,500 years. And then there were the death pits. This is where it gets difficult. In the largest royal tombs, Woolley found not just the principal burial, but dozens of additional bodies. In one tomb, attributed to a figure Woolley called Queen Pu-Abai, he found the remains of 74 people alongside her. In another, the so-called King's Grave, he found 63 women and 6 men. These people had not been sacrificed in a chaotic or violent way. They had been dressed in their finest clothes. The women wore elaborate headdresses of gold and lapis. They had positioned themselves in orderly rows. They had, it appeared, drunk poison willingly, or at least in a controlled and ceremonial way, and then waited to die. We do not know exactly what they believed was happening. We do not know if they considered this an honor, a duty, a spiritual privilege, or something they had no realistic power to refuse. We know that they did it with a degree of apparent order and ceremony, and that the world they left behind considered this burial arrangement appropriate for the royal dead. That detail lives in you for a while, the tidiness of it. The women who arranged themselves in rows and then lay down in their gold headdresses and waited. We will never know what they were thinking. We will never know if they were afraid. What we know is that they were real. And the Bible, the name resonates in a particular way in the Western world, and that resonance comes directly from the book of Genesis. Abraham, the patriarch of 3 of the world's major religions, was, according to the text, born in of the Chaldees. His family left and traveled to Haran in what is now southern Turkey, and from there the story of Abraham unfolds. The covenant, the journey to Canaan, the near sacrifice of Isaac, the whole complex origin story of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This is not a small thing. When you're standing in the ruins of you are, depending on your tradition, standing in the birthplace of a story that shaped the moral and spiritual framework of something like 4 billion people. That is a significant piece of real estate. The problem is that the identification of biblical with the Sumerian city of is not entirely settled. There are scholars who accept it completely, scholars who accept it with qualifications, and scholars who are skeptical for various reasons, including the geography of the narrative and the question of whether the phrase of the Chaldees maps cleanly onto the southern Mesopotamian city or some other location entirely. The Chaldeans were a later people who moved into the region after the Sumerian period, and their identification with the ancient city is a historical complication that different interpreters resolve differently. What is not in dispute is that people have believed this identification for a long time, that it shaped how the site was understood, how it was valued, and eventually, how it was excavated. Woolley was aware of the biblical resonance, and he was not above leaning into it in his popular writings. When he found evidence of a massive flood deposit during his excavations, he floated the suggestion that this might be the flood, the biblical flood, Noah's. The suggestion was picked up enthusiastically by newspapers around the world and then quietly walked back by the archaeological community, which pointed out that flood deposits in river delta cities are not exactly unusual and do not require divine intervention as an explanatory framework. But the connection endured, and in a way, it is the connection that saved from complete obscurity. If Abraham had not been placed here, if the site had no resonance beyond its intrinsic archaeological importance, it is possible it would have received less attention, less funding, less of the sustained scholarly interest that eventually gave us the picture we have. Sometimes a myth is what keeps the memory alive long enough for the facts to be recovered. The end of did not end suddenly. That is not how most ancient cities end, though we will meet a couple of exceptions tonight. Declined slowly, across centuries, through a combination of forces that historians have been debating since they started seriously studying the city. The first blow came from the north. Around 2000 BCE, a people called the Amorites swept into Mesopotamia from the Levantan steppe, disrupting the political structures that the third dynasty of had built. The third dynasty, whose most famous king was Namu, was arguably Ur's golden age, a period of monumental construction, legal codification, and regional dominance. Namu produced one of the earliest known law codes in human history, predating Hammurabi by about 300 years, and it contains provisions for damages in personal injury cases, regulations for weights and measures, and protections for widows and orphans that sound, if you strip away the specific cultural context, remarkably familiar. The Amorite disruption ended the third dynasty. The city continued. It was absorbed into the orbit of larger Mesopotamian powers, first the empire of Isin-Larsa, then the Old Babylonian period under Hammurabi's dynasty. Persisted as an important religious and commercial center for centuries after its political dominance ended, because the ziggurat of Nana was too important to simply abandon, and because the harbor remained functional. But the harbor was the real issue. Over centuries, the Euphrates shifted course. Rivers do this. The geology of southern Mesopotamia is dynamic in ways that are invisible on human timescales but relentless on geological ones. As the river moved away from the harbor became less reliable, the irrigation networks became harder to maintain, the agricultural productivity of the surrounding region declined. Without agricultural surplus, the city could not feed itself. Without the harbor, it could not trade for what it could not grow. The last cuneiform tablets from date to around 500 BCE, the Achaemenid Persian period. After that, silence. The city did not explode or burn or suffer a dramatic catastrophe. It just gradually, over generations, became not worth the effort of maintaining. The population drifted away to more viable locations. The mud brick buildings, unrepaired, began to dissolve back into the earth from which they had been made. The desert advanced. The silt accumulated. By the time Alexander the Great swept through the region in 331 BCE, was already mostly ruins. By the time the Arab geographers of the medieval period were making their careful records of the Mesopotamian landscape, the site was known only as Tel al-Muqayr, the Mound of Bitumen, named for the waterproofing material that the ancient builders had used extensively and that still seeped through the soil. A ziggurat remained. It still remains today, partially reconstructed in the 1980s by Saddam Hussein's government in a restoration project that historians politely describe as enthusiastic, and that archaeologists describe in somewhat more colorful terms, because the reconstruction involved cement and modern brick and a great deal of guesswork, and has made certain aspects of the original structure permanently difficult to study. But it is still there, 39 centuries after Ur-Nammu built it. In a landscape that is otherwise flat and empty, the ziggurat of the moon god Nana, sticking up out of the desert like a question that the earth is still waiting to be asked. What Ur leaves behind the legacy of Ur is not in the spectacular way it was lost, because it was not lost spectacularly. The legacy is in what it tells us about what cities actually are. Ur was not built because its location was inherently advantageous. It was built because human beings made it work. They diverted rivers, built harbors, organized irrigation networks, created administrative systems to manage the distribution of resources, developed writing partly as a tool for keeping track of all of this. When the river moved and the climate shifted and the external political pressures made the effort required to maintain all of that exceed the returns, the city stopped. Not dramatically, not with a bang. Just quietly, over generations, with the kind of unglamorous entropy that is the most common ending for most things. Ur lasted as a significant urban center for something like 3,000 years. Rome lasted about 1,000. The United States is approximately 250 years old. Keep that in mind. The city that Rome needed you to forget: Carthage, North Africa, modern Tunisia, circa 814 BCE to 146 BCE. Here is a sentence that Roman schoolchildren learned: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. It is possibly the most famous example of political messaging in the ancient world, and it was delivered, according to tradition, by a Roman senator named Marcus Porcius Cato, also known as Cato the Elder, also known as Cato the Censor, a man who was, by almost any historical account, absolutely exhausting to be around. Cato was a conservative Roman in the purest sense, a man who believed deeply in the old values of Roman simplicity and virtue, and who took it as a personal affront that anyone anywhere might be enjoying themselves in ways of which he had not approved. He was suspicious of Greek culture, suspicious of luxury, suspicious of innovation, and apparently, above all else, suspicious of Carthage. The story goes that Cato ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of what the speech was about, with the phrase Carthago delenda est. He gave a lot of speeches. He felt strongly. In 146 BCE, Rome finally agreed with him, destroyed Carthage utterly, and then, for good measure, began constructing an elaborate mythology around why this had been both necessary and virtuous. The mythology is worth examining because it tells you as much about Rome as it does about Carthage. And once you start examining it, you begin to notice something interesting. Almost everything you have been told about Carthage was told to you by people who had a vested interest in making Carthage sound like it deserved what happened to it. That is a problem. The traditional date for the founding of Carthage is 814 BCE, which would make it roughly contemporary with the later stages of Ur's decline and about 60 years before the traditional founding of Rome. The city was established as a Phoenician colony, an outpost of the great trading city of Tyre on the coast of what is now Lebanon. The Phoenicians were the maritime merchants of the ancient Mediterranean, the people who spread the alphabet across the ancient world, we will get to that, who traded in everything from purple dye to tin to glass to people, and who founded colonies from Cyprus to Spain to the coast of North Africa. Carthage, in Phoenician Kart Hadasht, simply means new city. This is not unusual. Half the cities in the Phoenician colonial world had names that translated to something like the settlement we founded on that trip. The Phoenicians were practical people, and they named their establishments accordingly. The founding myth of Carthage is considerably more interesting than its name, and unlike most founding myths, it has a named female protagonist, which is already unusual. Dido, also known as Elissa, was a Phoenician princess, the daughter of the king of Tyre, who fled her home city after her brother Pygmalion murdered her husband Sychaeus for his wealth. Dido escaped with a group of followers, sailed west across the Mediterranean, and arrived on the North African coast at the spot where Carthage would be built. The local Berber king, Irbaz, said she could have as much land as an oxhide could cover. Dido cut the oxhide into the thinnest possible strips and used them to encircle a hilltop. She called this hill Biasa. On this hill, the city of Carthage was founded. This story is almost certainly not historically accurate, but it is historically useful because it tells you something about how Carthaginians understood their own origins. A woman of intelligence and ruthlessness, forced from her home, using cleverness to establish a new home on difficult terms. There is a survivalist resourcefulness in the myth that maps fairly well onto what Carthage actually became. The city in its prime by the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Carthage was not just a city, it was an empire, the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Its trading network stretched from Sardinia and Sicily in the east to the Atlantic coast of Iberia in the west, and Carthaginian ships had sailed down the African coast and possibly reached the British Isles, though the evidence for the latter is contested. Carthage controlled the Strait of Gibraltar, which meant it controlled access to the Atlantic. It controlled the silver mines of Iberia, the agricultural wealth of North Africa, the trade routes through which tin from Cornwall and grain from Sicily, and slaves from everywhere flowed into the Mediterranean world. The city itself, on its promontory on the Gulf of Tunis, was formidable. At its peak, the population was somewhere between 300,000 and 700,000 people, depending on which ancient source you consult and how much you trust ancient source provided population figures, which honestly not very much, but even the lower end of that range makes Carthage one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The city had walls, massive walls. Triple walls in places, along the isthmus connecting the city to the mainland, walls that ancient writers described as being wide enough to stable horses in the towers and house soldiers in the interior. The harbor was divided into two parts, a commercial harbor for merchant ships and a military harbor, the Cathon, for the war fleet, which was the most powerful naval force in the Western Mediterranean for centuries. The military harbor was a marvel. It was circular, about 300 meters in diameter, with a central island on which the Admiralty building stood, looking out over 220 ship sheds arranged around the perimeter. From the central island, the admiral could see every vessel in the fleet simultaneously. The harbor was designed so that warships could be prepared and launched with remarkable efficiency. This was not accident. This was engineering in the service of strategic power. Carthage was governed not by a king but by a system of elected suffetes, a word usually translated as judges or magistrates, roughly analogous to Roman consuls, who served as the chief executives of the state. There was a senate, a popular assembly, and a powerful council of elders. The system was admired, sort of, by Aristotle, who mentioned it in his Politics as an example of a mixed constitution, neither pure democracy nor pure oligarchy. The Carthaginians were clearly not barbarians by any reasonable Greek definition of the term, and even Greek writers occasionally acknowledged this while also finding them deeply suspicious, because the Greeks and Carthaginians were in competition in Sicily, and acknowledging someone's sophistication is easier when they are not competing directly with you. The economy was extraordinary. Carthage did not just trade, it manufactured. Carthaginian purple dye, extracted from murex shellfish in an industrial process that colored the entire coast, was worth, weight for weight, more than silver. Carthaginian agricultural techniques, particularly those developed in the surrounding countryside where their Libyan territories had been developed into productive farmland, were so advanced that after Carthage fell, Rome translated and preserved the agronomical texts of Mago the Carthaginian, a writer on farming whose work was considered authoritative for centuries afterward. Think about that. Rome destroyed Carthage so thoroughly that, as one ancient writer put it, the very stones were scattered. And then Rome carefully preserved the Carthaginian farming manual. The Carthaginians were, in short, a sophisticated, literate, commercially brilliant, politically complex, cosmopolitan people who built one of the most successful trading empires the ancient world had ever seen, and who, for about 3 centuries, made Rome very nervous indeed. The wars, the conflict between Rome and Carthage, the 3 Punic Wars fought between 264 BCE and 146 BCE, is one of the great geopolitical contests of the ancient world, and it was by no means a foregone conclusion. Rome nearly lost. In the Second Punic War, between 218 and 201 BCE, Rome came as close to extinction as it would come until the sack of the city in 410 CE, and that is not an exaggeration. The agent of Rome's near destruction was Hannibal Barca. Hannibal is one of those historical figures who tends to get described as a genius so frequently that the word loses its meaning. So let us try to be specific about what he did. In 218 BCE, Hannibal led an army of roughly 38,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and somewhere between 37 and 40 war elephants across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, across the Alps in late autumn, and into the Po Valley of northern Italy. The Alpine crossing, completed in approximately 15 days, in conditions that killed a significant portion of his army and all but a handful of his elephants, remains one of the most impressive feats of military logistics in recorded history. He arrived in Italy with a reduced but functional force, and then, for the next 15 years, rampaged across the Italian peninsula, winning battles that military scholars still study today. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, Hannibal ambushed an entire Roman army in a fog, killing roughly 15,000 soldiers in about 3 hours. It is considered one of the most successful ambushes in military history. At Cana in 216 BCE, he surrounded a Roman army of somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 men and destroyed approximately 2/3 of them in a single afternoon. Cana was so traumatic for Rome that it became the standard reference point for catastrophic military defeat for the next 2,000 years. Military academies still teach it today. The United States Military Academy at West Point teaches Cana. It was that bad, and yet Rome did not surrender. This is the part of the story that gets less attention than Hannibal, but it is in many ways the more remarkable part. After Cannae, Rome's allies in Italy began to defect to Hannibal. Rome faced the real prospect of complete political dissolution. The Senate debated emergency measures, and then it did what Rome did, which was dig in, commit to a war of attrition, refuse to engage Hannibal directly in the open field, and slowly, systematically bleed his support away. Hannibal could win battles. He could not win the war without reinforcements, without siege equipment, without the political collapse of Rome that he had assumed would follow his military victories. Rome refused to collapse. The reinforcements from Carthage were slow, contested, and ultimately insufficient. Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal led an army from Spain to join him and was defeated and killed at the Battle of the Metaurus River in 207 BCE. The first Hannibal learned of this was when Roman soldiers threw his brother's head into his camp. It took Rome another 6 years to force Hannibal back to Africa, and another 2 years after that to defeat him at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. The Roman general Scipio Africanus, who had spent years studying Hannibal's tactics and applying them against his own army, used a modified version of the Cannae encirclement against Hannibal, and it worked. It is a strange kind of tribute that the tactic which ended Carthage's best chance at survival was one invented by Carthage's greatest general. The Tophet question here is where we have to slow down and be honest about a complicated historiographical problem. One of the most notorious elements of Carthaginian culture, as described in ancient Roman and Greek sources, was child sacrifice. The Romans called the sacred precinct where this allegedly took place the Tophet, and they described it as a place where Carthaginian parents burned their infant children alive as offerings to the gods Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. The descriptions are lurid and detailed. They were repeated throughout Roman propaganda. They appear in accounts of the Punic Wars. They have shaped the image of Carthage in Western culture ever since. The problem is the evidence. Archaeologists have found a location in ancient Carthage that was clearly a burial ground for infants and young children. They have found thousands of urns containing cremated remains of children alongside the remains of animals, which were certainly used in ritual contexts. Inscriptions on many of the urns dedicate the contents to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute is what this tells us. One school of thought holds that this is exactly what the Romans said it was, the physical evidence of a systematic child sacrifice cult. Another school holds that this was a burial ground for children who died in infancy, possibly accompanied by animal sacrifices, and that the Roman interpretation is propaganda designed to make Carthage sound monstrous. A third view is that both things may be partially true, that animal sacrifice and possibly occasional ritual child sacrifice occurred, but that the scale and systematic nature described by Roman writers was vastly exaggerated for political purposes. This debate is genuinely unsettled, and any account of Carthage that presents it as definitively one thing or another is simplifying a situation that the physical and textual evidence does not cleanly resolve. What is clear is that Rome had every reason to portray Carthage as a place of barbaric evil, because Rome destroyed Carthage and then needed the people who came after to believe that destruction had been justified. The propaganda of victors is always suspect, and in this case, the victors were thorough. Carthaginian literature, history, philosophy, and official records were almost entirely destroyed. We have Mago's farming manual and some fragmentary inscriptions. That is it. We are hearing about Carthage almost entirely from the people who killed it and then spent centuries explaining why it deserved to die. Cato, remember, ended every speech with Carthago delenda est. He said this before the Third Punic War began. He said it before Carthage had done anything to directly threaten Rome. He said it because Carthage existed and was prosperous and was not Rome, and apparently that was enough. The destruction, the Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, is one of the uglier episodes in Roman military history, which is saying something because Roman military history has some very steep competition in the ugliness department. By 149 BCE, Carthage was already a diminished power. It had been stripped of its Spanish territories, its war fleet, and its ability to make war without Roman permission by the terms of the treaty ending the Second Punic War. It was still prosperous in trade, still a significant city, but it was not an existential threat to Rome. Roman senators knew this. Some of them said so. Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica argued against the war, saying that Rome needed Carthage as a rival to keep itself sharp. He lost the argument. Cato and his allies won. Rome demanded that Carthage surrender hostages, then weapons, then move its entire population 10 miles inland from the coast, which would effectively destroy its identity as a trading city. When Carthage refused this final demand, Rome besieged the city. The siege lasted 3 years. The Carthaginians, despite being outmanned and outgunned, fought with extraordinary tenacity. Ancient sources describe women cutting off their own hair to provide bowstring material for the city's defenders. Workshops in the city produced swords and shields and spears in quantities that astonished the Roman commanders. Street fighting in the final stages of the siege was vicious enough that the young Roman officer commanding the final assault, Scipio Aemilianus, is reported to have wept as the city burned, not from sentiment but from terror at the sight of a civilization being erased, and the knowledge that the same thing could happen to Rome someday. The historian Polybius was present. He recorded the moment. He asked Scipio what he was thinking. Scipio quoted Homer. He quoted the passage where Hector prophesies the destruction of Troy, and he applied it to Rome. He saw what was happening to Carthage, and he thought of Rome. The city was burned. The survivors were killed or enslaved. The physical infrastructure was demolished with a thoroughness that was almost methodical. The harbor was filled in. The walls were pulled down. The upper city was razed. The tradition that Rome salted the earth of Carthage to ensure nothing would ever grow there again is probably a later invention, a metaphor that became a legend. Modern historians are skeptical of it, but the spirit of it is accurate. Rome wanted Carthage not just destroyed but erased. It wanted the erasure to be permanent and legible. It wanted the place of Carthage to be a wound in the earth that would never heal. A Roman colony was later founded on the site. It was called, without apparent irony, Carthage. What Carthage leaves behind is a problem. Not a historical problem, though it is that too, but a philosophical one. We lost something when Carthage fell. Not just a city, not just an empire, but a perspective. A Phoenician-descended, North African, non-Greek, non-Roman way of being in the Mediterranean world that had its own literature and art and religion and political tradition, and all of it is gone. Almost entirely gone. What we know of Carthage, we know from its enemies. We are reading the prosecution's brief and the defense has been silenced. When we say that history is written by the victors, Carthage is what we are talking about. This is the founding case. This is the example that gives the cliché its weight. And there is a reason Cato kept saying it. saying it over and over until it happened. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. The repetition was not emphasis, it was incantation. If you say something enough times in the right rooms, eventually the rooms make it happen. We are still living in the world that phrase made. The city where civilization learned to shower. Mohenjo-daro, Indus Valley, modern Pakistan, circa 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE. You are standing in a bathroom. This is not a metaphor. You are standing in an actual bathroom, in a house, in a city, and this bathroom has a brick floor with a slight slope toward the corner where the drain hole is. The drain hole connects to a pipe, a clay pipe, fired and sealed against leakage, that runs through the wall and connects to the main drainage channel in the street outside. The main drainage channel is covered. It is covered with bricks fitted carefully, removable for cleaning. The drainage system runs beneath every street in this city. Every house has access to it. Many houses have a bathroom or washing area. Some have toilet facilities. The infrastructure for managing human waste in this city is, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinary. You are standing in Mohenjo-daro, circa 2500 BCE, and the civilization around you is doing something that most of the ancient world would not manage for another 2,000 years. It is doing urban planning. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization after Harappa, the first major site to be excavated, flourished across a vast area of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India between approximately 3300 and 1300 BCE. At its peak around 2600 to 1900 BCE, it covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, comprising hundreds of settlements ranging from small villages to substantial cities. It is, by almost any measure, the largest of the four great early civilizations, the others being Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, and it is the least known. This is partly because its writing system, the Indus script, remains undeciphered. Thousands of small tablets and seals covered in Indus script signs have been found, but no bilingual text has ever been discovered, no Rosetta Stone equivalent that would allow modern scholars to map the signs to known phonemes or meanings. Without a decipherable writing system, historians cannot access the civilization directly. They cannot read what its people said about themselves, their gods, their politics, their history. What they can read is the physical evidence. And the physical evidence is extraordinary. Mohenjo-daro, discovered by British Indian archaeologists in the 1920s and meaning Mound of the Dead in Sindhi, was one of two major urban centers in the Indus Valley Civilization, the other being Harappa, about 600 kilometers to the northeast. The city covered approximately 300 hectares and had an estimated population of between 40,000 and 80,000 people, making it one of the largest cities of its era anywhere on Earth. The grid, the thing that stops every archaeologist who first seriously engages with Mohenjo-daro, is the grid. The city was built on a grid plan, a proper orthogonal grid with wide main streets running north-south and east-west and narrower lanes dividing the blocks between them. The main streets were up to 10 meters wide enough for carts to pass each other without congestion. The lanes were narrower but still regular and clearly planned. This is not accidental organic growth. This is design. Someone at some point in the founding of this city or an early stage of its development decided how the streets would run, and the city was built accordingly. And the city was rebuilt accordingly, multiple times. Archaeological evidence shows that Mohenjo-daro was rebuilt at least 7 or 9 times over its occupation, each time following essentially the same grid plan. When buildings fell or were destroyed or became obsolete, they were replaced by new buildings in the same positions, on the same alignments, maintaining the same street plan. The commitment to the urban form was apparently so strong that it outlasted individual buildings by centuries. The city was divided into 2 main sections. To the west, a raised citadel area that contained public or civic buildings. To the east, the lower city where the majority of the population lived and worked. This division between an elevated public zone and a lower residential zone is not unique to Mohenjo-daro, but the scale and regularity with which it was executed here is remarkable. The Great Bath on the Citadel Mound, archaeologists found one of the most discussed structures in the ancient world, a large, carefully waterproofed tank that has come to be called the Great Bath. It is approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and nearly 3 meters deep. The floor and sides are constructed of precisely fitted fired brick, and the entire basin was waterproofed with a layer of natural tar bitumen applied to the exterior of the brick lining. Steps descend into the pool from both ends. What was it for? This is where the undeciphered writing system becomes a genuine impediment, because without textual evidence, we are guessing. Most scholars believe the Great Bath was used for ritual bathing or purification, possibly connected to religious ceremonies. Ritual bathing in water is an important element of South Asian religious traditions, including Hinduism, and the possibility that these traditions have extremely deep roots that trace back to the Indus Valley civilization is one of the most intriguing speculations in the archaeology of the region. But it is speculation. We do not know what the people who used the Great Bath believed, what they called it, what rites they performed, or what deity or principle those rites were intended to honor. What we know is that someone built it with extraordinary care and technical precision, and that the waterproofing technology involved, fired brick plus bitumen caulking, represents a sophisticated understanding of how to manage water in an architectural context that would not be matched in many parts of the world until considerably later. Around the Great Bath were colonnaded halls and other structures that may have been administrative buildings, possibly residential quarters for priests or officials, a large building with a hypocaust-like underdoor structure that some have interpreted as a granary and others as a ventilated warehouse for some other purpose. The citadel as a whole seems to have been a zone of civic and perhaps religious function, separate from but connected to the residential city below. Daily life in the lower city of Mohenjo-daro, is where most people lived, and walking through its ruins, or imagining yourself doing so in the second half of the 3rd millennium BCE, you encounter something that feels both ancient and modern in a way that is genuinely disorienting. The houses of Mohenjo-daro were built from standardized fired brick. Not just any brick, standardized brick, produced to a consistent ratio of roughly 1:4, the same ratio used across multiple Indus Valley cities. This standardization implies either a centralized manufacturing system, which we have no clear evidence for, or a set of widely shared and consistently applied technical norms, which in its own way is even more impressive because it implies a shared technical culture operating across hundreds of kilometers of territory without the coercive infrastructure of a centralized state. The houses ranged from small single-room dwellings to large multi-roomed structures with central courtyards. Many had an area with brick flooring and drainage that appears to have served as a washing or bathing space. The drainage connected to the street drainage connected to the main channels. Some houses had what appear to have been toilet facilities, brick-lined pits or covered drains positioned in locations and configurations consistent with use as latrines. The streets were clean by the standards of contemporary ancient cities. We know this because of the drain covers, the covered channels, the attention given to managing runoff and waste. We know this because excavations of the streets show relatively little accumulation of the kind of organic debris that tends to pile up in ancient urban contexts where nobody is managing it. Someone was managing it. Who? We do not know. We do not know how Mohenjo-daro was governed. We have found no palaces, no obvious royal tomb, no monument that clearly marks a ruler's presence. We have found no weapons caches that would suggest a military class. We have found evidence of what appear to be administrative activities, stamped seals used to mark goods in trade, standardized weights that suggest regulated commerce, but no clear temple complex analogous to Ur or Babylon, no monument to a divine king. The Indus Valley Civilization is the only one of the four great early civilizations for which we have, as yet, no clearly identifiable political hierarchy. No king list, no pharaoh's name, no conquering hero, just the city and the drains and the standard brick and the extraordinary regularity of it all. The art the Indus Valley left art, not monumental art, not colossal statues of divine kings, but small, careful, beautiful things. The stamped seals are the most numerous and arguably the most fascinating. Thousands of them have been found across Indus Valley sites. They are small, typically a few centimeters square, made of carved steatite, a soft stone that could be worked with fine tools and fired to hardness. Each seal bears one or more animals rendered with a precision and naturalism that is genuinely startling given their age. A bull with an enormous dewlap, every muscle articulated, a rhinoceros, a tiger. And the most iconic of all, the animal that Indus Valley archaeologists call the unicorn for lack of a better name, a creature that resembles a bull or bovine, but with a single curving horn projecting from its forehead. The unicorn seal appears across the entire geographic extent of the Indus Valley civilization, suggesting it had some unifying cultural or possibly religious significance. Each seal also bears a short inscription in the Indus script, usually 5 to 7 signs. These inscriptions may be names, titles, the names of owners or manufacturers, religious formulae, or something else entirely. Without decipherment, we cannot know, but they are there on every seal, consistent and careful, made to be pressed into clay to mark goods, to authenticate transactions, to identify their owners. The seals tell us the civilization was literate, commercially active, and capable of fine craft. The terracotta figurines, mostly female, found across the region, may be devotional objects or toys or both. A small bronze dancing girl found at Mohenjo-daro, a figure of a young woman leaning back with one hand on her hip and a coiled bracelet on her arm, has become one of the most famous objects from the ancient South Asian world, not because it is the most technically accomplished piece of bronze casting ever done, but because it is so clearly, unmistakably alive. She is poised mid-movement. She looks as if she is about to say something. She has been saying nothing for 4,000 years. The end around 1900 BCE, the major urban centers of the Indus Valley civilization began to decline. By 1700 BCE, Mohenjo-daro had been largely abandoned. By 1300 BCE, the civilization as a coherent entity had ended. What happened is, again, a matter of scholarly debate and genuinely ongoing research. The older explanation, advanced by the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler in the mid-20th century, was an invasion, specifically the invasion of the Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples from Central Asia, whose arrival is associated with the Vedic traditions that eventually became Hinduism. Wheeler interpreted some skeletal remains at Mohenjo-daro as evidence of violent death in the city's final phase, and connected this to the Vedic hymns describing the destruction of cities. This interpretation is now largely discredited, or at least significantly nuanced. The skeletal evidence does not clearly support mass violent death as a primary factor. The decline was gradual and geographically uneven, with some areas declining earlier than others, which does not fit the profile of a swift military conquest. The current scholarly consensus leans toward climate change and river alteration as major factors. Evidence suggests that the monsoon pattern shifted during this period, reducing rainfall and agricultural productivity across the region. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system, which had supported much of the eastern part of the civilization, appears to have weakened substantially, possibly due to tectonic activity that altered its course. Without reliable water, agriculture fails. Without agriculture, cities cannot be fed. Populations did not vanish. They dispersed. They moved east and south into the Gangetic Plain. They adapted. What we think of as the Indus Valley civilization ended, but the people continued. Some scholars argue that elements of Indus Valley culture, including possibly the ritual bathing traditions, the female deity iconography, certain craft traditions, survived and were eventually incorporated into the emerging Vedic and later Hindu cultural complex. The precise relationship between the Indus Valley civilization and the historical cultures that followed it in South Asia is one of the most contested questions in the archaeology and history of the region, and it has taken on political dimensions in modern India that make objective discussion difficult. Some Indian nationalist narratives want to claim the Indus Valley civilization as straightforwardly ancient Hindu civilization. The evidence does not support this straightforwardly. But the evidence also does not support complete discontinuity. The truth is probably more complicated than either strong claim allows, which is almost always the case with the truth. What Mohenjo-daro leaves behind the Indus Valley civilization built cities with sanitation systems that would have been the envy of cities 3,000 years younger. They standardized their building materials across hundreds of kilometers. They maintained a consistent urban form across multiple rebuilding cycles. They traded across vast distances with a regulated system of weights and seals. They did all of this, apparently, without a visible military, without a visible divine king, without the monumental propaganda architecture that tells us so much about what Egypt and Mesopotamia valued. What does that mean? It might mean they were more egalitarian. It might mean their political structure was simply of a kind we do not yet recognize in the archaeological record. It might mean we have not found the right buildings yet. We do not know. What we know is that they built the drains. They built them carefully, lined them with brick, covered them so they would not smell, made them accessible for maintenance, and connected them to every house in the city. And whatever happened to them, whatever ended their world, those drains outlasted everything else. The drains are still there. There is something almost comforting about that. The city with no name, Teotihuacan, central Mexico, circa 100 BCE to 550 CE tonight, you are walking the Avenue of the Dead. It is 6 in the morning and the light is the color of pale gold and the air smells like the high plateau of central Mexico, dry and thin and ancient. Ahead of you, at the end of a boulevard 2.4 kilometers long and 40 meters wide, the Pyramid of the Sun rises 65 meters into the sky. To your right, the Pyramid of the Moon sits at the far northern end of the avenue like the period at the end of a very long sentence. Around you, the platforms and compounds and plazas of a city stretch out in every direction. A city that was, at the moment you are imagining, the largest city in the Western Hemisphere and the 6th largest city in the world. You do not know what this city is called. You do not know because nobody told you. Nobody told you because nobody knows. The people who built this city, who lived here for centuries, who constructed the largest pyramid in the world by volume, and decorated their apartment buildings with painted murals and established trade networks that reached from the Gulf of Mexico to Guatemala, never gave us their name. Or more precisely, their name for their city, their name for themselves, and their language are lost so completely that the name we use, Teotihuacan, is not their name at all. It is a Nahuatl name, the language of the Aztec people who encountered the ruins of this city nearly 1,000 years after its abandonment. It means roughly the place where the gods were made, or the place where men became gods, depending on translation. We call it Teotihuacan because the Aztec called it Teotihuacan. The Aztec called it that because they found an enormous, ancient, abandoned city, and their traditions told them that the gods had created the world here. This may or may not have any connection to what the original inhabitants believed about their own city. We cannot know. The scale numbers first, because the numbers are the thing that stops you. At its peak, around 400 to 450 CE, Teotihuacan had a population estimated at between 100,000 and 250,000 people. The estimate range is wide because population reconstruction for pre-literate societies is an uncertain science, but even the conservative lower bound makes Teotihuacan, for its time, one of the most densely populated places on Earth. London at the same period had perhaps 50,000 inhabitants. Rome was larger, perhaps 500,000 to 1 million, but Rome was the capital of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. Teotihuacan was, as far as we can tell, a city-state, an extraordinarily large, complex, powerful city-state, but not the administrative center of an identifiable conquered empire in the way Rome was. The Avenue of the Dead, which the Aztec named but which the original inhabitants surely called something, is the central axis of an urban design that is extraordinarily coherent. The whole city was laid out on a grid, like Mohenjo-daro, but this grid was rotated approximately 15.5 degrees east of north. Scholars have speculated extensively about why. Astronomical alignment is the most common explanation, specifically alignment with the position of the Pleiades or with certain solar events. The most widely cited current theory is that the orientation was set by the mountain to the northeast of the city, and the position of the sun relative to it at a specific ritual date. Whatever the reason, the orientation was not accidental. It was maintained across the entire city plan, including the course of the San Juan River, which was canalized and diverted to follow the grid, rather than the grid following the river. A river was moved to fit the city plan. Let that sink in. They moved the river. The pyramids are the most famous structures, but they are perhaps the least representative of daily life in Teotihuacan. More significant, in terms of what they tell you about the city's social complexity, are the apartment compounds. Teotihuacan was a city of apartment dwellers. Archaeological excavation has found approximately 2,000 apartment compounds spread across the city, each compound housing somewhere between 60 and 100 people in a series of rooms arranged around a central courtyard and altar. Each compound appears to have housed people engaged in related occupations: a craftsman's compound, an obsidian worker's compound, a compound housing potters from the same ethnic group or origin region. This is urban housing at scale. This is urban planning that anticipates and organizes not just traffic flow but social organization. The residents of each compound shared a courtyard, shared an altar, possibly shared a deity. The compound was a social unit as well as a physical one. It was the basic building block of Teotihuacan society. Who were they here is the frustrating and wonderful thing about Teotihuacan. We know an enormous amount about how these people lived, and almost nothing about how they talked about themselves. We know what they ate from botanical and faunal remains: maize, beans, squash, deer, rabbit, turkey, dog. We know what they made from the extraordinary density of craft production evidence: obsidian tools and weapons processed in workshops across the city, ceramic vessels of distinctive style, figurines, painted pottery. We know where their trade goods came from: mica from Veracruz, obsidian from quarries north of the city and from far-flung exchange networks, greenstone from Oaxaca, cacao from the Gulf lowlands, shell from both coasts. We know from the murals something about what they worshipped, though interpreting imagery without texts is always hazardous. A figure associated with rain and agricultural fertility, whom scholars often call the Great Goddess or the Storm God depending on which representations they are looking at, appears in many murals. The feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl in later Nahuatl tradition, is represented in architecture across the city, most spectacularly on the feathered serpent pyramid, whose facade is covered with alternating feathered serpent heads and goggle-eyed rain deity heads of extraordinary technical quality. The building dates to around 200 CE and was apparently important enough that its dedication was accompanied by the sacrifice of over 200 individuals, whose remains were found in burials around and beneath the structure. We know from both the murals and the apartment compound pattern that the city was multi-ethnic. Teotihuacan appears to have been a genuinely cosmopolitan urban center, attracting or absorbing populations from multiple regions of Mesoamerica. A specific district of the city shows strong evidence of Oaxacan Zapotec inhabitants, based on ceramic style, burial practices, and architectural features consistent with Oaxacan tradition. Evidence for Veracruz connections exists in other parts of the city. Teotihuacan was not a monoculture. It was a metropolis, and yet no text, not a syllable of their language, not a name, not a king list, not a dedication. The murals are rich with imagery and bare of writing. The ceramic vessels are decorated but uninscribed. Whatever writing system the Teotihuacanos used, if they used one, has not survived. Some scholars argue they had no writing system, that they communicated administrative information through other means, through standardized iconography, through the organization of material culture, through systems that did not require the recording of speech. Others argue that their writing was perishable, recorded on bark, paper, or textiles that have not survived. Others argue that writing has been found in the glyphic elements of certain murals, but not yet adequately deciphered. We do not know. We genuinely do not know. The reach of Teotihuacan, what we do know with considerable confidence, is that Teotihuacan's influence reached far beyond its walls. In the Maya lowlands, 1,000 kilometers to the south, there is a site called Tikal. Tikal was one of the major Maya cities of the Classic period, and in 378 CE, something happened there that archaeologists and historians have been trying to understand ever since. An individual whose Maya name was Cahokia, fire is born, arrived at Tikal from the west, from the direction of Teotihuacan. On the same day he arrived, the reigning king of Tikal died. Cahokia was associated with a figure whose name is often translated as Spurther or Owl, apparently a Teotihuacan ruler or emissary. The subsequent ruler of Tikal, Yaxnun-Ahian, wore Teotihuacan-style dress in his portraits, and the Teotihuacan-style storm god imagery appears in Tikal art of this period. This was either a conquest, a coup facilitated by Teotihuacan, or a very aggressive diplomatic takeover, and it permanently altered the trajectory of one of the most powerful Maya polities of the period. Teotihuacan's military, commercial, or political reach, more than 1,000 kilometers from the city, was real and consequential. Teotihuacan-style objects and architectural features appear at sites across Mesoamerica. The Obsidian trade network centered on Teotihuacan distributed materials across an enormous region. Teotihuacan-style pottery and figurines turn up at sites from central Mexico to Guatemala. This was a world power, an ancient, nameless world power that we are only beginning to understand. The end around 550 CE, something happened in Teotihuacan. The evidence is dramatic. Archaeological excavations have found a layer of burning concentrated specifically in the civic and religious structures along the Avenue of the Dead. The feathered serpent pyramid was burned. The temples and palaces of the city center were burned. The apartment compounds of the residential city were not burned, or not systematically. The burning was selective, targeted at the symbols of authority and religious power, not at the places where ordinary people lived. This pattern is the signature of an internal revolt. The city did not fall to foreign invaders. The city burned itself. Or rather, the residents of the apartment compounds appear to have burned the palaces and temples of whoever ruled them, destroyed the infrastructure of the central power, and then dispersed. The city did not immediately empty. Population continued for perhaps another century, declining slowly, but the peak was over. The central authority, whatever it had been, was gone. By 700 CE, the city was largely abandoned. The people, as always, did not vanish. They dispersed into the regions surrounding the city, carrying with them the material culture, the craft traditions, possibly the religious ideas that had developed in the city over centuries. Some of them are likely among the ancestors of the people later known as the Toltec. Some of them are likely among the ancestors of populations across the central Mexican plateau. The ruins of the city stood. The pyramids stood. The Avenue of the Dead remained. When the Aztec encountered the ruins, perhaps 6 or 7 centuries after the abandonment, they recognized what they were seeing as something ancient and sacred. They incorporated Teotihuacan into their own mythology. Their creation story situated the birth of the current sun and moon at this place. Their rulers made pilgrimages here. They brought offerings. They were, in their way, the first archaeologists of Teotihuacan. What Teotihuacan leaves behind, what Teotihuacan leaves behind, is a question, and the question is, what does it mean to build a city without leaving a name? Every other civilization we discuss tonight left us something to call them by. The Sumerians left their language. The Carthaginians left their name in the mouths of their enemies. The Indus Valley people left their seals, even if we cannot read them. Teotihuacan left us nothing but the city itself, and the city is staggering. The city is 1,000 years of continuous occupation, 2 centuries of peak urban density, an extraordinary achievement of planning and construction and social organization and long-distance trade. The city is real. The people were real. We just do not know what to call them. We do not know what they called themselves. There is something almost Buddhist about that. The city existed. It was perhaps the most impressive thing happening in the Western Hemisphere for 3 centuries. It influenced civilizations 1,000 kilometers away. It shaped what came after, and it never needed us to know its name. The city that loved everybody, Palmyra, Syrian desert, circa 1st century BCE to 273 CE in the 1st century CE. A Roman traveler named Pliny the Elder wrote about a city in the Syrian desert that he described as having a fate set apart from the great empires of the world, standing between the Romans and the Parthians and making money off both of them. He was not wrong. Palmyra, the city Pliny was describing, sat in an oasis in the Syrian desert, 240 kilometers from the nearest significant water source, in a position that by any reasonable geographical logic should have been uninhabitable and was, commercially speaking, the most strategically positioned city in the world, because Palmyra sat between Rome and Persia. And everything Rome wanted from Persia, and everything Persia wanted from Rome, and everything both of them wanted from China and India passed through the Syrian desert. And in the Syrian desert, there was essentially one route that offered reliable water. And on that route, sitting in its oasis like the universe's most ambitious toll booth, was Palmyra. The traders' city Palmyra, the Greek and Latin name, is Tadmor in Aramaic, the city's original Semitic name, and Tadmor appears in ancient texts going back to the Bronze Age. The location was not accidental. The Efka spring, which still flows today, provided reliable water in a landscape where reliable water was the difference between life and death. The city that grew up around that spring eventually became the fulcrum of the most important trade route in the ancient world. The goods that moved through Palmyra in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE reads like a catalog of every luxury that the ancient world craved. Silk from China, carried by Parthian and later Sasanian Persian merchants across Central Asia to the western edge of the Iranian plateau, then across the Syrian desert to the Mediterranean. Spices from India, pepper and cinnamon and cardamom, arriving by sea at the Persian Gulf ports and then overland through Palmyra to the Roman world. Incense from Arabia, frankincense and myrrh from the southern Arabian Peninsula, products of sacred as well as commercial value that moved north along the incense road through the desert. Textiles and glass and wine and olive oil and grain moving in the other direction, east and south. The merchants of Palmyra were the intermediaries for all of it. They traveled with the caravans, they organized the logistics, they negotiated with the various powers through whose territory the goods passed, they maintained the relationships that kept the roads open and the caravans safe. The Palmyran merchant aristocracy was fabulously wealthy. We know this because they advertised extensively. Palmyra is covered with inscriptions that honor wealthy merchants who contributed money to civic building projects, funded festivals, paid for the maintenance of road infrastructure, donated to religious institutions. These inscriptions name the merchants, describe their achievements, and in many cases were accompanied by portrait sculptures, carved figures of the honored individuals placed in the colonnaded streets of the city where everyone could see them. Palmyra's colonnaded street, the main axis of the city, was approximately 1.2 kilometers long and was lined with more than 750 columns. At regular intervals, corbels projected from the columns supporting portrait busts of honored citizens. Walking down the main street of Roman-era Palmyra was like walking through a permanent outdoor gallery of civic virtue, every successful merchant immortalized in stone, staring down from their columns at the caravans passing below. The city was gorgeous. Ancient visitors said so, and the archaeological evidence confirms it. The Temple of Bel, the main religious complex, was one of the most impressive temples in the Roman East. The theater was well preserved enough that modern performances were staged in it before the events of the last decade made that impossible. The agora, the banqueting halls, the elaborate funerary towers rising at the city's edges where wealthy families buried their dead in multi-story carved limestone tombs, all of it told the same story. This was a city that was proud of itself, that had money, that had taste, and that wanted visitors to know it. The Palmyrenes, the people of Palmyra, were, like the city itself, a mixture. The language of daily life was Aramaic, the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, in a local dialect now called Palmyran. The official language of public inscriptions was both Palmyran Aramaic and Greek, the administrative language of the Eastern Roman Empire. Latin appears in inscriptions involving Roman officials. Many inscriptions are bilingual or trilingual. The religion was equally mixed, combining the worship of Bel and other Semitic deities with elements of the Greco-Roman pantheon and possibly influence from the Parthian East. The Palmyrans were Arab in the broad ancient sense of the term, which meant broadly a Semitic-speaking, desert-dwelling people of the Syrian-Arabian plateau. They were not fully integrated into Roman culture and not fully integrated into Persian culture. They maintained their own identity, their own customs, their own aristocratic traditions, while adopting and adapting elements from both of the great powers between whom they navigated. They were, in the best sense of the word, cosmopolitan. They had to be. Their economic model required it. The men of Palmyra, as depicted in the funerary sculptures, wore a combination of Roman and local dress, a Roman toga or tunic combined with a distinctive headdress or jewelry that marked them as Palmyran. The women of Palmyra, also depicted with striking frequency in the funerary art, wore elaborate jewelry, layered clothing, and an expression that has been described by many scholars as direct. They look at you from their limestone portraits with a gaze that is neither the idealized blank beauty of Greek portraiture nor the propagandistic confidence of Roman official art. They look like themselves, individual, specific, alive. The Palmyran funerary busts are among the most remarkable portrait sculpture from the ancient world, partly because of their quantity and partly because of their quality. They are not generic. They are portraits of individual people. The sculptor, working in the 1st to 3rd century CE, was trying to capture specific faces, and in many cases they succeeded with an intimacy that is startling. Zenobia, and then there was Zenobia. Septimia Zenobia became the effective ruler of Palmyra following the death of her husband Odenathus in 268 CE. Odenathus had been the man who saved the Eastern Roman Empire, which in the 260s CE was in deep and possibly terminal crisis. The Emperor Valerian had been captured by the Persian King Shapur I in 260 CE, the first Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by a foreign power, and the eastern provinces were in chaos. Odenathus, the king of Palmyra, stepped into the vacuum. He organized the defense of the eastern frontier. He pushed the Persians back. He stabilized Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia at a time when Rome was absolutely incapable of doing so. Rome, in a remarkable acknowledgement, gave him the title of corrector of all the East and essentially handed him authority over the eastern half of the empire. When Odenathus was assassinated in 268, his son Vabilathus, a child, nominally became king. His mother Zenobia became regent, and then, for practical purposes, the actual ruler. Zenobia was remarkable by any standard. Ancient sources, admittedly mostly writing after her downfall, describe her as physically striking, highly educated, personally austere, and politically ambitious in a way that made Roman emperors extremely uncomfortable. She spoke, according to Zosimus, 4 languages: Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and Egyptian. She maintained a brilliant court at Palmyra that attracted scholars and philosophers. She rode on horseback at the head of her army and marched on foot with her soldiers for miles at a time, refusing the softness of a carriage. In 270 CE, she invaded Egypt. In 271 CE, she controlled Egypt, Syria, Arabia, and much of Asia Minor, roughly a third of the Roman Empire's territory. She declared her son Vabilathus Augustus, the Roman imperial title, and herself Augusta, effectively claiming to rule a separate empire. The new Roman Emperor Aurelian, who was in the process of putting the Roman Empire back together after 2 decades of crisis, was not particularly pleased about this. The war between Aurelian and Zenobia in 272 CE was brief but decisive. Aurelian defeated the Palmyran forces at the Battle of Emi near Antioch and again at the Battle of Emesa. Zenobia retreated to Palmyra and then attempted to flee east, toward Persia, seeking aid. Aurelian's cavalry caught her at the Euphrates. She was taken prisoner. The city of Palmyra surrendered. Aurelian was, initially, relatively merciful. He spared the city, garrisoned it with Roman troops, and moved on. Then, almost immediately, the Palmyrans rose in revolt, killing the Roman garrison. Aurelian came back. This time he was not merciful. He sacked Palmyra, killed many of its inhabitants, and destroyed the city as a political and economic entity. The Temple of Bel was converted into a Roman fort. The colonnaded street was garrisoned. The merchant aristocracy that had made the city was broken. Zenobia herself survived. The ancient sources are not entirely consistent on what happened to her, but the most commonly accepted account is that she was taken to Rome, paraded in Aurelian's triumph, and then settled in a comfortable villa in Tivoli, near Rome, where she lived out her days in comfortable captivity, married to a Roman senator, very far from the desert. The city she had ruled never recovered. It continued as a minor settlement, as a waypoint, as a place of ruins visited occasionally by travelers and scholars. The trade routes shifted. The desert reclaimed the edges of the city. The sand drifted against the columns. The portrait busts stared down from their corbels at fewer and fewer people. Palmyra in our time in 2015, fighters of the Islamic State captured Palmyra. Over the following months, they deliberately destroyed significant portions of the ancient city. The Temple of Bel's Cella was blown up. The Temple of Balshamin was destroyed. The famous Roman arch at the beginning of the colonnaded street was demolished. The statues in the Palmyra Museum were smashed. Khaled al-Assad, the 82-year-old archaeologist who had spent his entire career studying and preserving Palmyra, and who refused to reveal where the city's most valuable portable artifacts had been hidden for safekeeping, was publicly executed. This chapter does not have a place for cheap commentary on that. Some things are what they are. Palmyra was partially recaptured and partially destroyed again in subsequent years. Some of what was destroyed has been or is being digitally reconstructed. Some of it is simply gone. What Palmyra leaves behind is the portrait busts. Hundreds of them are in museums around the world. The faces of Pomeran merchants and their wives and their children, staring out from their limestone with that particular directness that the Pomeran sculptural tradition gave them. They do not look like Rome. They do not look like Persia. They look like Palmyra, which was both and neither, which sat between the empires and made itself necessary to both, which built a city of astonishing beauty in a desert because the desert happened to sit at the crossroads of everything. They look like people who knew something about surviving. The city before cities, Çatalhöyük, Central Anatolia, modern Turkey, circa 7500 BCE to 5700 BCE tonight. Everything you think you know about how civilization begins is wrong. Not wrong in every detail, wrong in the sequence, wrong in the causal story. You have been told explicitly or implicitly that civilization follows agriculture, that agriculture makes surplus, that surplus enables specialization, that specialization produces craftsmen and administrators and priests and scribes, that craftsmen and administrators and priests and scribes form the nucleus of a city, and that a city is what civilization looks like. This is a reasonable story. It is also not quite right. Because before any of the cities we have discussed so far, before Ur and before the Indus Valley and certainly before Rome, there was Çatalhöyük. And Çatalhöyük breaks the model in ways that archaeologists spent decades arguing about and are still, in some respects, arguing about today. The discovery Çatalhöyük, pronounced roughly Çatalhöyük, means forked mound in Turkish, which is a functional description of the site's geography. It sits on the Konya Plain in central Anatolia, a flat agricultural region that in the Neolithic period was considerably wetter and more productive than it is today, and it was discovered in the late 1950s by a British archaeologist named James Mellart, who noticed it while surveying the region and began excavating it in 1961. What Mellart found was remarkable enough that it immediately drew international attention. A settlement of roughly 13 hectares, occupied continuously for approximately 1,800 years, from about 7,500 BCE to about 5,700 BCE, containing the densest concentration of decorated interiors yet discovered from the Neolithic period. Çatalhöyük had wall paintings. It had plaster reliefs. It had sculptured bulls' heads mounted on walls with actual bulls' horns still attached. It had figurines, including the famous seated female figure found in a grain bin that has been interpreted as a fertility goddess, and which is one of the most reproduced images from the prehistoric world. It had an extraordinary density of human life compressed into a small area, and it had a population estimated at somewhere between 3,500 and 8,000 people living there at any one time. This was, by any reasonable definition, a town, possibly even a city. And it predated agriculture's clear dominance of its economy. The people of Çatalhöyük were in transition, still hunting wild animals alongside their kept animals, still gathering wild plants alongside their cultivated ones. This was not a fully agricultural society in the way Ur was. And yet the density, the complexity, the sustained social organization required to keep 5,000 or more people living together in a space of 13 hectares for 1,800 years. This was urban in everything but the standard model. Living without strets, the most immediately strange thing about Çatalhöyük, the thing that makes every artist's reconstruction of it look faintly impossible, is that it had no streets. The houses of Çatalhöyük were built directly against each other, sharing walls with no space between them. The settlement was essentially a single continuous structure, a honeycomb of rooms and spaces in which every unit shared at least one wall with the units around it. There were no alleys, no lanes, no courtyards between houses, nothing. You entered your house from the roof. Every Çatalhöyük house had a hole in the roof that served as the entrance, accessible by a wooden ladder that leaned against the opening from outside. The roof was communal space in the sense that you walked across your neighbor's roofs to reach your own. You descended into your house through the ceiling. The ladder, positioned on the south wall inside, served as the point of entry and exit. This layout has real consequences for how the settlement worked. You could not, in any practical sense, sneak around. You were always visible on the rooftop. Your neighbors knew your movements. The communal roof space created a kind of enforced visibility that would have shaped social dynamics in ways that archaeologists have spent decades trying to understand. There was very little private space in the sense that modern urban dwellers understand it, and yet, paradoxically, within each house, life was intensely domestic and contained. The houses themselves were broadly similar in plan. A main room, roughly rectangular, with a raised platform along one wall that served as the sleeping and sitting area. A small side room used for storage. A hearth and oven in specific, consistent positions within the main room. The walls were plastered repeatedly, new layers of lime plaster applied over old ones, and many houses showed evidence of multiple repainting episodes, white plaster over white plaster, sometimes decorated, sometimes plain. The buried dead under the floors of those houses, the dead were buried, not in a cemetery, under the floor, where you slept, where you ate, where you spent every day of your life. Your grandmother was buried under the platform you sat on. Your children's children would eventually be buried under the same floor. This was not a problem or a tragedy. This was simply where you buried people. The house was the family unit not just in life but in death. Skeletal analysis of the burials has been one of the most productive sources of information about Çatalhöyük society. Isotopic analysis of the bones can reveal what people ate, where they grew up. Different regions have different isotopic signatures, how closely related they were to each other. Some of the findings have been surprising. The people buried in the same house were not always biologically related. The household, it seems, was not always the nuclear or extended biological family. It may have been a social unit defined by co-residence and cooperation rather than blood. People who were not related by blood were sometimes buried together under the same floor for generations, suggesting a form of household formation that does not map neatly onto Western assumptions about family structure. The population itself showed evidence of coming from multiple origins, at least in the later phases of occupation, suggesting that Çatalhöyük attracted or absorbed people from a wider region. The settlement was, in its own Neolithic way, cosmopolitan. The art of Çatalhöyük is unlike anything else from the Neolithic world, in both its quantity and its subject matter. The wall paintings are the most famous. Geometric patterns, hands, stars are common. But the most striking are the figurative paintings. dense scenes of hunting in which small human figures confront enormous bulls or deer, or more disturbing, scenes that have been interpreted as depicting vultures circling or descending on headless human figures. The hunting scenes are extraordinary for their energy and their scale. The animals are huge relative to the human figures, which may reflect genuine difference in scale or may be a deliberate representational choice. The humans are small but active, running, gesturing in poses of engagement rather than dominance. The headless human figures and the vultures are harder to interpret and are connected to a broader pattern in the physical evidence. Çatalhöyük had a complex and evidently ritualized relationship with skulls. Some skulls were separated from the rest of the skeleton and treated differently. Some were plastered and modeled, features painted on, as was done in other early Near Eastern sites. Some of the skulls buried under house floors were clearly not from the same individual as the rest of the skeleton with which they were associated. The most spectacular architectural feature, repeated in numerous houses, was the mounting of actual cattle skulls and horns on the walls and on plaster benches or installations within the main room. These were not decorative in any casual sense. They were installed with care and seriousness, positioned in consistent locations, treated as significant objects. The bull, the wild aurochs from which domestic cattle were eventually bred, was clearly a powerful symbol in Çatalhöyük's world. Large, dangerous, vital to survival as a food source, connected in some way to the cosmological framework of the community. The equality question, one of the most persistent and contested questions about Çatalhöyük, concerns social organization, and specifically whether the society was egalitarian. The early interpretation, championed by Mellart and by the archaeologist and theorist Marija Gimbutas, was that Çatalhöyük was not just egalitarian, but specifically organized around goddess worship and female social dominance, a matriarchal society that represented an ancient European and Near Eastern tradition of peaceful, egalitarian life before patriarchy and violence arrived with later cultures. The goddess interpretation drew enormous popular attention and influenced a generation of feminist spirituality movements. The seated female figurine found in the grain bin became an icon. The problem is that the evidence does not clearly support this strong interpretation. The seated female figurine is the one widely reproduced. There are in fact many figurines from Çatalhöyük, and many of them are not clearly female, and some are clearly male, and many are animals, and some are ambiguous. The goddess reading was partly a projection of modern hopes onto ambiguous evidence. That said, the skeletal evidence does suggest something genuinely interesting about social organization. The burials do not show clear evidence of differential status of the kind that appears in later hierarchical societies. Rich burials versus poor burials, elite compounds versus worker quarters. The houses at Çatalhöyük are remarkably similar in size and construction. The grave goods are not dramatically unequal. This is not proof of perfect equality, and later phases of the occupation do show some evidence of increasing differentiation. But compared to the cities we have discussed before, the material evidence at Çatalhöyük suggests a social order that did not yet include the kind of entrenched hierarchy that characterizes the fully urban societies of the Bronze Age. This may simply reflect the society's small scale and pre-state nature, or it may reflect something genuinely different about how this community organized itself. We do not know with certainty. Çatalhöyük was occupied continuously for about 1,800 years, and then abandoned around 5700 BCE. The abandonment was not abrupt and was not clearly caused by catastrophe. The population seems to have declined gradually over the final centuries of occupation, and the settlement was not replaced by another settlement in the same location. Why? Climate change is the current best candidate. The Konya Plain appears to have become drier during the period of Çatalhöyük's decline, reducing the agricultural and pastoral productivity that supported the settlement. The people, as always, did not disappear. They dispersed. They moved into regions that could support them. The Neolithic in Anatolia was expanding and differentiating during this period, with populations spreading across the region and eventually into Europe, and the descendants of Çatalhöyük's people are among the ancestors of modern Europeans. The mound sat silent for 6,000 years. The lime plaster walls, protected by the accumulated debris of centuries of occupation, and then by the soil of the plain, waited. Mellart found them in the 1960s. Ian Hodder's team has been excavating them since 1993 with steadily increasing sophistication. What Çatalhöyük leaves behind is the question of why people gather. The standard model says people gather in cities because of agriculture, because of surplus, because of the efficiencies of specialization and trade. And maybe that is mostly right. But Çatalhöyük gathered thousands of people in one place before those mechanisms were fully in place. The people of Çatalhöyük chose density, chose proximity, chose living in a honeycomb of shared walls with their neighbors' roofs over their heads and their ancestors under their floors, and they made that choice work for nearly 2,000 years. Maybe people gather because people want to gather. Maybe the fundamental human impulse that produces cities is not economic logic but social desire, not efficiency but belonging, not surplus but presence. If that is true, then Çatalhöyük is not just the earliest proto-city we have found. It is also a comment on why cities exist at all. The city under the volcano Akrotiri, Santorini, ancient Thera, Greece, circa 1700 BCE to 1620 BCE tonight, you are in the most perfect museum in the world. Not a building, a city. An actual Bronze Age city, preserved almost entirely intact under approximately 60 meters of volcanic ash and pumice, excavated with the care of surgeons over the past 5 decades, revealing room by room and floor by floor a world that ended so suddenly and so completely that the bread is still in the ovens. The bread is still in the ovens. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened at Akrotiri. The eruption around 1620 BCE, give or take a few decades depending on which dating method you accept, and the dating science is genuinely contested. The volcanic island of Thera in the Aegean Sea erupted. Thera is what is now called Santorini, the crescent-shaped island with the white houses and blue domes that fills every Instagram feed in the Aegean, and its picturesque crescent shape exists because the eruption approximately 3,600 years ago was so catastrophic that the central part of the island collapsed into the caldera left by the volcanic explosion. What remains is the rim of what was once a much larger, roughly circular island. The eruption of Thera was, by most estimates, one of the largest volcanic events in human history. Some estimates put it at 4 to 5 times the scale of Krakatoa's 1883 eruption. It ejected somewhere between 30 and 80 cubic kilometers of material. The ash cloud reached the stratosphere. Evidence of the eruption's ash layer has been found in ice cores from Greenland and in sediment cores from the eastern Mediterranean. The eruption produced tsunamis that struck the coastlines of Crete and the eastern Mediterranean. It may have contributed to significant climate disruption across the region for years afterward. The people who lived on Thera did not survive this eruption. They could not have survived this eruption. But here is the thing, they knew it was coming, or they knew enough. Because Akrotiri, the Bronze Age city on the southern tip of the island, was empty of human remains when archaeologists excavated it. The people left. They had warning, possibly in the form of an earlier, smaller eruption or a series of earthquakes that preceded the main event, and they took their portable valuables and they got on boats and they left. The city was evacuated. What was left behind was everything that was too heavy or too large or too logistically difficult to move. The buildings, the furniture, the storage jars still containing grain and olive oil and dried fish. The wall paintings, brilliant and complete on the plastered walls of houses that had been preserved as if in amber. The millstones and the loom weights and the bronze tools and the pottery, the bread in the ovens. The city Akrotiri was discovered in the late 1960s by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, who had spent years developing the theory that a major volcanic event on Thera was connected to the decline of Minoan civilization on Crete, which flourished during the same period. He began excavating on Thera in 1967 and almost immediately found what he was looking for: a city buried under the ash, preserved in extraordinary condition, clearly related to but distinct from the Minoan civilization of Crete. The excavation has been ongoing since Marinatos' death in 1974, when he died on site after falling into a trench, and the city that has emerged from the ash is remarkable on multiple levels. The buildings are 2 and 3 stories tall. They are built of stone and mud brick with timber framing for earthquake resistance, the Aegean being seismically active territory, and the Bronze Age Aegean being a place where building codes, informal as they were, had incorporated lessons from previous earthquakes. The ground floor rooms were used primarily for storage, large pithai standing upright in rows, once filled with oil and grain. The upper floors were the living spaces. The living spaces had wall paintings. This is where Akrotiri becomes something that defies easy categorization as just an archaeological site. The wall paintings of Akrotiri are among the finest surviving examples of Bronze Age pictorial art anywhere in the world. They are vivid, technically accomplished, and extraordinarily informative about the world the Akrotirians inhabited. The paintings The Spring Fresco, from a room now called the House of the Spring Fresco or Room Delta 2, shows a landscape of red and black volcanic rock, with white lilies growing in clusters from crevices, and above them, swallows flying. The swallows are painted with a looseness and a joy that is almost shocking given the painting's age. They dart and swoop across the plaster with an energy that feels observed rather than symbolic. Someone in Akrotiri in approximately 1650 BCE watched swallows flying over the rocky hillsides where lilies grew in spring, and they painted what they saw, and the painting survived 3,500 years of burial to be found, still vivid, still alive with movement. The Flotilla fresco from the West House shows a maritime scene of extraordinary complexity, a fleet of ships with rowing crews and passengers sailing between 2 towns. The towns are shown in detail sufficient to allow inferences about Bronze Age Aegean architecture and harbor design. The ships are crewed by figures whose dress and posture can be analyzed. The sea is populated with dolphins and flying fish. It is a panoramic narrative painting, arguably the earliest example of landscape and narrative combined in Western art, and it is so large and detailed that scholars have been studying it for decades and are still discovering new things in its imagery. The Boxing Children fresco shows two boys in combat, their bodies painted with an attention to musculature and movement that would not be out of place in later Greek art. The Blue Monkeys fresco shows a landscape populated by Cercopithecus monkeys, a species native to Africa or possibly India, which tells you something about the trading connections that brought exotic animals to Aegean shores. The Saffron Gatherers fresco shows women harvesting saffron crocus blossoms, an extraordinarily valuable commodity in the Bronze Age world. These paintings do not feel like religious art or royal propaganda. They feel like the art of a prosperous, confident, worldly society that found beauty in the specific, the botanical, the maritime, the athletic. A society that wanted its walls to show it the things it loved. Connections and context. Akrotiri was clearly connected to the wider Bronze Age Aegean world. The material culture shows strong Minoan influence. The pottery types, the artistic conventions, the script, linear A, which appears on some objects found at the site, and which, like the Indus script, remains undeciphered. The people of Akrotiri were almost certainly literate, and almost certainly connected to the trading networks that linked Crete to the Greek mainland, to Cyprus, to Egypt, and to the Levant. The city's prosperity was built on trade and probably on the local production of goods, particularly textiles. The loom weights found in quantity at the site suggest weaving was a major industry. The storage facilities suggest the city was a distribution point for agricultural goods, probably including wine, olive oil, and grain from the island's terraced hillsides. It was a comfortable, sophisticated, visually rich place to live, in an era when comfortable and sophisticated were not available to most people most of the time. The Atlantis question: we have to address this. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, described the island of Atlantis, a great civilization that had been destroyed by catastrophic submergence into the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. Every generation produces at least one writer or documentary maker who is convinced that Atlantis was Thera, that the eruption of the Bronze Age volcano is the historical kernel behind Plato's myth. The theory is not entirely absurd. A large, advanced Bronze Age culture, destroyed catastrophically by a volcanic event that included tsunamis and possibly partial submergence in the Aegean region approximately 1,000 years before Plato. There are connections worth noting, but most classical scholars and archaeologists are skeptical of the direct identification. Plato's Atlantis is described as being in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar. It is described as being of an enormous size, a continent-scale island. It is described as being destroyed 9,000 years before Solon's time, not 900 years. The specific details do not fit. Plato, moreover, was a philosopher who used myths as philosophical vehicles. Atlantis may be primarily a philosophical construct, a device for exploring ideas about the corruption of a perfect state, rather than a historical memory encoded in narrative. The people who want it to be real are understandably seduced by how much better the story is if it is true. But wanting it to be true is not the same thing as it being true. What is true is that Akrotiri was real, that its people built a city of real beauty and real prosperity, that they had the sense to leave before the volcano killed them, and that what they left behind is one of the most astonishing archaeological gifts the ancient world has ever given us. What Akrotiri leaves behind the swallows, that is what Akrotiri leaves behind for me. The swallows in the spring fresco, darting above the red rocks where the white lilies are blooming, painted by a hand that has been dead for 3,600 years, preserved in the volcanic ash that destroyed their world, still moving. They have been flying for 3.5 millennia. They are flying right now. The American city nobody talks about Cahokia, Illinois, USA, circa 900 CE to 1350 CE. In the year 1050 CE, William the Conqueror was still 16 years away from invading England. The Norman conquest had not yet happened. The Crusades had not yet begun. Paris was a medium-sized town of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 people. London was smaller. In what is now southwestern Illinois, across the Mississippi River from the present-day city of St. Louis, there was a city. A real city with a planned urban core, a population estimated at 10,000 to 20,000 people within the city proper, and perhaps 40,000 in the broader metropolitan area, a monumental earthwork at its center that remained the largest man-made earthen structure in North America north of Mexico until the 20th century, and a sophisticated social and economic system that drew people and goods from hundreds of miles away. This city is called Cahokia. It is in the continental United States. Most Americans have never heard of it. The city Cahokia sits on the American bottom, the broad, flat floodplain of the Mississippi River south of its confluence with the Missouri, one of the most agriculturally productive landscapes in the continent. The river provided fish. The floodplain provided rich agricultural land suitable for intensive maize cultivation. The waterways provided transportation connections in every direction. The location was, in precisely the same way Palmyra's oasis was, a place where geography made density possible and commercially advantageous. The city that the Mississippian culture built here was organized around a central plaza area of approximately 19 hectares, larger than the central plaza at Teotihuacan. At the northern end of this plaza stood Monk's Mound, a flat-topped pyramid built from earth over multiple construction phases, rising approximately 30 meters, 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain. The base of Monk's Mound covers more area than the Great Pyramid of Giza. At its peak, a large building, presumably a temple or a chief's residence or both, stood atop the mound looking out over the city and the Mississippi beyond. The mound was not an isolated monument. It was the centerpiece of a complex of more than 120 mounds spread across the metropolitan area, ranging from small platform mounds that supported buildings to large conical burial mounds. The settlement was organized in a way that suggests significant central planning and social hierarchy, with the largest and most impressive structures concentrated near the central plaza and smaller, less monumental constructions toward the periphery. The city also had a palisade wall. Around 1100 CE, Cahokia constructed a wooden defensive wall around the central precinct, approximately 3 kilometers long, made of logs set vertically in a trench, with bastions at regular intervals to allow defenders to shoot along the wall's face. The palisade was rebuilt at least 3 times, suggesting it was both a real defensive installation and a marker of the central precinct's special status. Grand Plaza and Wodhng, the Grand Plaza between the Central Mound complex and the southern part of the city, was a large, flat, carefully leveled area that was clearly a designed public space. Archaeological analysis suggests the ground was deliberately prepared, graded to create a level surface, which would have required moving significant quantities of earth in a pre-mechanized context. The plaza was almost certainly the site of public gatherings, ceremonies, markets, and the social performances of power that large cities require. Near the western edge of the city, archaeologists found evidence of a series of large circular arrangements of wooden posts, now called Woodhenge, the comparison to Stonehenge being irresistible to both the scholars who named it and the journalists who covered the discovery. Multiple Woodhenges were constructed at different periods, each a circle of large posts set in prepared pits, with specific posts aligned to mark the sunrise at the solstices and equinoxes. Cahokia's Woodhenge was a calendar. The city was marking time, aligning its ceremonies with the agricultural cycle, connecting the human and the cosmological in the same way that the builders of Stonehenge and the Aztec astronomers and the designers of Teotihuacan's grid were connecting them. Ritual mattered here. The cosmos mattered. The alignment of the city with the sky was not accidental. Mound 72, in 1967, archaeologist Melvin Fowler excavated a small, ridge-top mound in the southern part of the Cahokia site, designated Mound 72. What he found there transformed the understanding of Cahokia's social structure and its religious practices. In Mound 72, a man was buried on a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon or bird of prey, his arms and legs aligned precisely. Around him were caches of grave goods of extraordinary quantity and quality, hundreds of projectile points in bundles, sheets of mica from the Appalachian region, copper from the Great Lakes, long-nosed god masquets. The shell bead burial is so striking that it has become one of the defining images of Cahokia in popular representation. Near this elaborate burial were mass burials of sacrificed individuals. 53 young women between the ages of 15 and 25 buried in 2 mass graves near the primary burial. 4 males buried together, apparently decapitated. Another mass grave nearby. The total number of sacrificed individuals in Mound 72 is somewhere around 270. Cahokia was not an egalitarian society. There was someone who got the shell bead burial, and there were people who got buried with the mound to serve whatever purpose the builders believed they served. The distance between those two groups is the distance between, at minimum, a chieftainship with the power to command lives and the people over whom that power was exercised. The Mississippian world Cahokia was not alone. It was the largest center of a cultural tradition that archaeologists call Mississippian, which spread across the eastern half of North America from roughly 800 CE to the 17th century CE, when European contact and European disease began catastrophically reshaping the continent's population and political landscape. Mississippian sites have been found from the Gulf Coast to Wisconsin, from Oklahoma to the Carolinas. Many of them show the characteristic features: platform mounds, plazas, organized around the prestige economy of tribute and redistribution that the largest centers could command. The stylistic tradition called the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, which includes the falcon motifs, the long-nosed god imagery, the specific forms of prestige goods, connected sites across an enormous geographic range. Cahokia was the apex of this tradition. The largest, the most elaborate, the center that most clearly exhibits the organizational complexity of a true urban center rather than a large chieftainship. At its peak, between approximately 1050 and 1150 CE, Cahokia was drawing people, materials, and ideas from an enormous hinterland. Shell from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes, chert from specific quarry regions, cedar for the woodhenge posts. People from villages across the surrounding landscape who moved, voluntarily or not, to the city. Cahokia began to decline around 1200 CE. Population dropped. Construction of new mounds slowed and eventually stopped. By 1350 CE, the city center was largely abandoned, and by 1400 CE, the city as such was gone. Explanations for the decline include environmental degradation, specifically the deforestation of the surrounding landscape to provide wood for construction and fuel, combined with the intensive agriculture required to feed a large urban population, which may have degraded soil productivity and increased erosion. A major flood event around 1200 CE, evidenced in the sedimentary record, may have been a significant disruption. Political fragmentation is also possible. The power structures that held the chieftainship together may have collapsed from internal tensions. The people who lived in Cahokia were the ancestors of historic period Native American peoples of the mid-continent, including the Osage, the Quapaw, and others. Some scholars have proposed that the later Natchez people, the only Mississippian society that survived in recognizable form into the European contact era, preserve cultural memories and practices continuous with the Cahokian tradition. But we cannot trace the continuity with certainty. Why you haven't heard of this Cahokia is administered by the state of Illinois as a state historic site. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, designated in 1982. It sits approximately 20 minutes by car from downtown St. Louis, and most Americans have never heard of it. There is no mysterious reason for this. There are very ordinary reasons. For most of American history, the dominant narrative of American civilization presented the pre-Columbian Native American world as a pre-urban, pre-monumental, essentially prehistoric backdrop against which European civilization arrived and expanded. The existence of a city larger than contemporary London in what is now Illinois, a city with monumental architecture and long-distance trade networks and complex social organization, complicated that narrative. It was easier not to teach it. It was easier to present the mounds as natural formations, which some early American settlers actually did, or to attribute them to a mythical mound builder race that was not Native American, which is a fantasy that persisted in popular culture well into the 19th century. Cahokia was built by Native Americans. Mississippian culture is Native American culture. The people who built Monk's Mound were the ancestors of people who are alive today. None of this should be surprising or controversial, but the systematic de-emphasis of Cahokia in American historical education suggests that, for a long time, it was both. What Cahokia leaves behind Monk's Mound is still there, somewhat eroded, stabilized in places by modern engineering, topped not by a chief's palace but by a parking lot that was eventually removed. The mound is still there, 30 meters high, overlooking the American bottom. It has been there longer than the United States of America has existed. It will probably still be there long after we are gone. The city at the end of the world, Angkor, Cambodia, circa 802 CE to 1431 CE. Tonight, you are lost in a forest. But it is not a wild forest. It is a forest that has grown over, through, and around a city. The roots of fig trees, banyan trees, the towering strangular figs called tetramels, have found the cracks in stone walls and grown into them and grown around them, and in some cases grown over them so completely that the tree and the stone have become a single structural element that neither could remove from the other without killing both. Roots cascade down carved stone faces like frozen waterfalls. Trees split temple towers. Galleries that once held columns of stone are now the interior architecture of a root system that uses the columns as a framework. This is Ta Prohm, one of the temple complexes of Angkor, and the trees have been growing here since the city was abandoned, slowly, over centuries, and now they are so completely part of the architecture that removing them would destroy the walls they are also destroying, and so they remain, spectacular and terrible, the living monument to what happens when a city is given back to the jungle. Angkor does this to people. It makes them reach for metaphors about time. The empire, the Khmer Empire, of which Angkor was the capital, was the dominant political entity in mainland Southeast Asia for approximately 6 centuries, from its founding by Jayavarman II in 802 CE to its gradual dissolution in the 14th and 15th centuries CE. At its territorial peak, it controlled or influenced an area that covered present-day Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, approximately 1.2 million square kilometers. Angkor was the capital of this empire, a city that at its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries CE had a population estimated at somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, making it possibly the largest pre-industrial city in the world at that time. 1 million people in a city in 12th century Cambodia. Contemporary London had perhaps 100,000. The city was not a compact urban nucleus of the kind that most ancient cities produced. Angkor was a vast, low-density urban landscape, a hydraulic city organized around an extraordinary water management system. The monuments that most visitors see, Angkor Wat, the Bayon, Ta Prohm, were religious and royal infrastructure embedded in a much larger urban fabric of residential areas, markets, roads, and above all, water. Water, the geography of the Mekong River basin in which Angkor sits, is defined by a seasonal cycle of dramatic extremes. During the wet season, the Mekong floods and backs up into the Tonle Sap Lake, which expands from roughly 2,500 square kilometers in the dry season to approximately 16,000 square kilometers at the flood's peak. During the dry season, the lake drains back into the Mekong. Fish in stupendous quantities are trapped in the receding waters. The rice, planted in the flooded fields, grows in the nutrient-rich silt left by the floods. This cycle was the engine of Angkor's agricultural productivity. The Khmer engineered it. They built a system of reservoirs, barrages, canals, and distribution channels that captured the monsoon rains and the flood waters and distributed them through the agricultural landscape. The West Barre alone is 8 kilometers long and 2.2 kilometers wide, a reservoir that held more than 50 million cubic meters of water. It was entirely dug by hand, the soil piled into embankments that still contain it 9 centuries later. The hydraulic system allowed double and possibly triple cropping of rice, producing agricultural surpluses that supported the enormous population and the massive construction projects that are Angkor's most famous legacy. The entire city was, at its core, a water management project in whose center the temples happened to be built. Angkor Wat, completed around 1150 CE by the Khmer king Suryavarman II, is the largest religious monument in the world. Not just the largest temple. the largest religious monument of any kind in the world. The outer enclosure wall runs approximately 1.5 kilometers from east to west and 1.3 kilometers from north to south. The moat surrounding the complex is 200 meters wide and approximately 5.5 kilometers in circumference. The central tower, representing the sacred mountain Meru at the center of the Hindu cosmos, rises 65 meters above the ground. The galleries are decorated with bas-relief carvings running for more than 800 meters, depicting scenes from Hindu mythology, including the churning of the Sea of Milk and the Battle of Kurukshetra, as well as historical narratives of Suryavarman's own military campaigns. The scale is such that it is genuinely difficult to understand from within the complex itself. You can walk through Angkor Wat for hours and still have a sense that you have not seen all of it. The galleries go on. The courtyards open into more courtyards. The towers recede as you approach and then loom when you are beneath them. It was designed to make you feel small in a specific, deliberate way, the smallness of a human being standing in the presence of the divine order of the cosmos. Angkor Wat was built as a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu. It was subsequently used as a Buddhist temple by the end of the 12th century and has functioned as a Buddhist temple continuously ever since, which is one reason it is the best preserved of the major Angkor monuments. It was never fully abandoned. Monks have lived and worshipped here for most of the centuries since its construction. It survived the abandonment of Angkor as a political capital because it was never abandoned as a religious site. The Bayon, built about a century after Angkor Wat by the Khmer King Jayavarman VII, is different in character and different in effect. Where Angkor Wat is orderly, geometrically precise, formally beautiful, the Bayon is overwhelming. Its towers, approximately 54 of them surviving from an original total estimated higher, are covered on all four faces with enormous carved stone faces, calm, slightly smiling, with closed eyes, each face approximately 3 meters tall. In the dim light of a Cambodian morning before the tour buses arrive, the Bayon is one of the most unsettling and extraordinary spaces a human being can enter. Whose face is it? Scholars have debated this for decades. It may be the face of Jayavarman VII himself, merged with the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, the embodiment of compassion in Mahayana Buddhism. It may be a generic face of Buddha or Bodhisattva. The smiling faces may represent the God looking down in all four directions, omnipresent, omniscient. Whatever the specific intention, the effect is of surveillance. You are seen. From every direction, you are seen. The stone faces watch the jungle and the pilgrims and the tourists and the sky with a calm that has not changed in 8 centuries. Angkor did not fall to a conquest, exactly, though there was a conquest. In 1431 CE, the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya sacked Angkor, and the Khmer court relocated to the south, eventually settling near the site of what would become Phnom Penh. But the decline had been underway for longer. Scholars using LiDAR technology, which allows the mapping of terrain beneath forest cover from the air with extraordinary precision, have revealed the full extent of the greater Angkor metropolitan area in recent years, and with it a clearer picture of what went wrong. The hydraulic system that sustained the city was its greatest strength and eventually its greatest vulnerability. A complex network of canals and reservoirs requires constant maintenance. Evidence from the LiDAR surveys suggests that the infrastructure began to fail in the 13th and 14th centuries. Canal banks breached and were not repaired. Silting in the channels reduced their capacity. the water management system became unmanageable, possibly due to a combination of reduced labor availability, political instability, and possibly climate change in the form of altered monsoon patterns. Without the hydraulic system, the agricultural surplus collapsed. Without the surplus, the city could not be fed. Without the city's ability to feed itself, the population dispersed to other areas with more reliable water and agricultural conditions, and the forest moved in. Slowly, quietly, root by root, over decades and then centuries, the jungle reclaimed what the engineers had taken from it. When the French naturalist Henri Mauhat encountered Angkor in 1860, he was not the first Western visitor, but he was the one whose journal entries captured the European imagination most effectively. He wrote about temples, so extraordinary a spectacle that one stands transfixed. He expressed what many visitors since have felt, a combination of awe at the scale of what was built and melancholy at the scale of what was lost. Angkor was never lost to the people of Cambodia. Angkor Wat had monks living in it throughout the centuries of supposed abandonment. Cambodian tradition maintained memory of the city. When Mauhat found it, he found it with the help of Cambodian guides who knew exactly where it was. It was not lost. It was just temporarily outside the attention of the West. What Angkor leaves behind the faces on the Bayon towers. They are still there. The 8th century after the court left, a century and a half after the French found them, decades after the Khmer Rouge period in which Cambodia suffered something that defies adequate description in a history podcast about ancient ruins. The faces are still there, calm, watching, slightly smiling. Time has passed. More time will pass. The faces, for now, remain. The city you think you know, Babylon, Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, circa 2300 BCE to 250 BCE. Let us start with what Babylon is not. Babylon is not a Beyoncé album, although it is a very good Beyoncé album. Babylon is not the biblical symbol of decadence and corruption, although the Bible certainly uses it as one. Babylon is not a metaphor for the oppressive systems of the world, although the Rastafarian tradition's use of Babylon, in this sense, is both culturally rich and historically grounded in its own way. Babylon is not the place where a tower was being built and God gave everyone different languages, although that story is set there. Babylon is not primarily the backdrop for apocalyptic prophecy. Babylon is a city, was a city, is a ruin. A ruin that was, for several centuries, the most important city in the world, not metaphorically. Actually, the largest city on Earth, the most sophisticated urban center of its era, the home of astronomical observation advanced enough to produce the mathematical models that Greek astronomers later built on, the home of legal tradition that shaped law codes across the ancient Near East, the home of gardens, and yes, we will talk about the gardens, but maybe not in the way you expect. The real Babylon sits on the Euphrates River in what is now central Iraq, approximately 85 kilometers south of Baghdad. The site has been inhabited since at least the 3rd millennium BCE, but Babylon's rise to prominence began under the Amorite king Sumu around 1894 BCE, when it became the capital of an increasingly powerful kingdom in the Mesopotamian alluvial plain. The city we talk about when we talk about Babylon is, in most contexts, the Babylon of two rulers. Hammurabi, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE and created the first Babylonian Empire, and Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, and whose Babylon was the one that impressed Greek visitors, conquered Jerusalem, and was large enough that the Greeks and Romans consistently cited it as the greatest city of the ancient world. These two Babylons are separated by more than 1,000 years. Between Hammurabi's city and Nebuchadnezzar's city, Babylon was sacked by the Hittites, dominated by the Kassites for 4 centuries, conquered by the Assyrians, briefly rebuilt, sacked again, and then reconstructed into the magnificent late Babylonian capital that the ancient world so admired. Babylon had, in other words, a very complicated career before it achieved its most famous form. Hammurabi and the Law Hammurabi is most famous for his law code, inscribed on a basalt stele nearly 2.25 meters tall, now in the Louvre in Paris, which was found at Susa in 1901, where it had been taken as war booty by an Elamite king who apparently appreciated good legal documentation. The Code of Hammurabi is not the oldest law code we have, as we noted when discussing Ur-Nammu. It is the most complete early law code we have, and it is the one that has most shaped the popular imagination about ancient law because of the eye for an eye principle, the lex talionis, which appears in several of its provisions. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If a builder builds a house that collapses and kills the owner's son, the builder's son shall be put to death. If a man strikes a pregnant woman and she miscarries, he shall pay a fine. If a man's wife is accused of adultery, she may clear herself by throwing herself into the river and surviving. This is not a modern legal system, but it is a legal system. It is a systematic attempt to codify standards for the resolution of disputes and the punishment of offenses, to make the law legible and consistent rather than dependent on the personal judgment of whoever happens to be in power at the moment. The aspiration toward consistency, toward a written law that applies across cases, is the thing worth noticing. It is not perfect consistency. The code clearly treats different social classes differently. Free men and slaves have different legal standing. But the impulse to write it down, to make it the same for everyone within a class, is the same impulse that eventually produces, however imperfectly, the legal traditions we inherit. Hammurabi commissioned the stele not because he was an enlightened reformer, but because having your laws inscribed on a giant stone column in public is a very effective piece of political messaging. It says, "I rule. These are the rules. The rules are fair. I am a just king. Worship me accordingly." Power has always been good at presenting itself as justice. The interesting thing about Hammurabi's code is that it also actually tried to be justice, at least within the social assumptions of its time. These things are not mutually exclusive. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the Babylon that most ancient writers were talking about when they said Babylon, was the city built and rebuilt by the Neo-Babylonian kings, culminating in the magnificent capital of Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for 43 years and spent much of that time building. The city he produced was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinary. Ancient sources give the city walls a circumference of somewhere between 14 and 18 kilometers. The walls were wide enough, according to Herodotus, who may or may not have visited personally, for 2 4-horse chariots to pass each other on top. Herodotus may be exaggerating, or he may be repeating exaggerations he was told. Herodotus's relationship with accurate measurement is complicated. But archaeological evidence confirms that the walls were massive, doubled, with a moat and a processional road cutting through the Ishtar Gate into the city's interior. The Ishtar Gate. Let us talk about the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate was the main ceremonial entrance to Babylon, built around 575 BCE during Nebuchadnezzar's reign. It was a double-arched gateway approximately 14 meters high, surfaced entirely with glazed brick in deep blue, the blue achieved through the same copper compounds that the Babylonian glaziers had mastered over centuries. Across the blue surface, in raised relief, marched rows of alternating animals: the lion, sacred to the goddess Ishtar; the bull, sacred to the weather god Adad; and the Sirush, a dragon-like composite creature sacred to the god Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, shown with a scaly body, the hindquarters of an eagle and a serpent's head. The gate was the entrance to a city whose color was blue. The glazed brick surfaces of its major monuments were blue. The Euphrates flowing through the city was blue. The sky was blue. Everything in the axis of procession between the gate and the great ziggurat of Marduk, the Etemenenki, was an experience organized around the sacred color of the city's patron god. The reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate, now in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, is one of the great reconstructions of the ancient world. It is fragmentary. Some of the reconstruction is interpolated from adjacent evidence, but standing in front of it, you get a genuine sense of what it meant to walk through the entrance to Babylon. Overwhelming, intentionally so. The Hanging Gardens, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They were described by Greek and Roman writers as a series of terraced gardens rising above the city, irrigated by machines that raised water from the Euphrates to the upper levels, dense with trees and flowers and the sounds of water, a kind of vertical park in the middle of a flat desert city, built by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median queen Amytis, who missed the green mountains of her homeland. This is a beautiful story. It is also a story for which there is not yet any clear archaeological evidence. Excavations at Babylon have been extensive, particularly those conducted by the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and no structure has been identified that clearly corresponds to the Hanging Gardens as described. Some scholars have proposed that the gardens were real, but not where we have been looking, possibly in a portion of the city not yet excavated or inadequately preserved. Others have argued more controversially that the Hanging Gardens were actually in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and that later Greek writers confused the two cities. The most straightforward possibility is that the Hanging Gardens were real, that they were extraordinary, that they were described by visitors and travelers whose accounts circulated in the ancient world, and that the archaeological evidence is simply not there, either because the organic material has not survived, or because the hydraulic structures that would have supported them have been misidentified or not found, or because the gardens were built in a way that left less archaeological trace than we would expect. Or they were a legend. The ancient world was not above mythologizing its greatest cities. We genuinely do not know. And for a place as well documented as Babylon, not knowing something this fundamental is both frustrating and instructive. The Babylon of astronomy here is the Babylon that gets less attention than it deserves. The Babylonian astronomical tradition was one of the most sophisticated intellectual achievements of the ancient world. Over centuries, Babylonian scholars, sometimes called the Chaldeans in ancient Greek sources, developed systematic methods for predicting celestial events, particularly eclipses, by carefully recording observations and finding mathematical patterns in those observations. The Babylonian astronomers did not have telescopes. They had the naked eye, a clear desert sky, and several centuries of accumulated observations recorded on clay tablets. With these tools, they developed a predictive algorithm for lunar eclipses that was accurate enough to work. They tracked the positions of the planets against the background of the stars with sufficient precision to identify the Saros cycle of eclipse repetition, a period of approximately 18 years and 11 days after which the geometry of Sun, Moon, and Earth returns to a similar configuration, and eclipses repeat in a predictable pattern. They developed mathematical methods for predicting the positions of the planets that were sophisticated enough that the Greek astronomer Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century BCE, incorporated Babylonian data that predated his own observations by centuries. The astronomical tradition of Babylon was transferred, imperfectly and through various channels, to Greek scientific culture, and from Greek culture, it eventually became part of the foundation of Western astronomy. The names of the zodiacal constellations, the division of the sky into 360 degrees, the concept of the degree itself as a unit of angular measurement, all of these derive, directly or through intermediary transmission, from Babylonian astronomical practice. We owe the way we think about the sky, in part, to astronomers who worked in Babylon 2,500 years ago. They are rarely given credit for this in the popular accounts of the history of science, partly because the history of science, for a long time, liked to begin its story with the Greeks. Babylon fell. Of course it fell. They all fall. But Babylon's fall was less a dramatic conclusion and more a long process of becoming irrelevant. Cyrus the Great of Persia captured Babylon in 539 BCE, presenting himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, releasing the Jewish exiles held there since Nebuchadnezzar's deportations, and making a point of respecting the city's religious institutions and cultural prestige. The Cyrus cylinder, found in 1879 and now in the British Museum, records Cyrus's version of his own conquest, emphasizing his respect for Babylon's gods and his restoration of sacred sites. It is propaganda, but thoughtful propaganda, designed to tell the Babylonians that their city and their traditions were honored by their new rulers. Babylon remained an important city under the Persians, then under Alexander the Great, who died there in 323 BCE at the age of 32, possibly of typhoid fever and alcohol toxicity, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Alexander had planned to make Babylon his capital. The plans dissolved with his life. Under Alexander's successors, the Seleucids, a new Greek city called Seleucia on the Tigris was founded nearby and gradually drained Babylon's population. The Parthians controlled the region from the 2nd century BCE, and Babylon continued as a smaller settlement, with a Jewish community that maintained Babylonian scholarly traditions and Babylonian language into the Common Era. The great ziggurat of Marduk, the Etemenenki, fell into decay and was gradually quarried for its bricks. The city shrank. The population dispersed. The desert advanced. By the 2nd century CE, Babylon was ruins. The Greek geographer Pausanias mentioned it as a place that had been great. By the time of the Arab conquests in the 7th century CE, it was a landscape of dusty mounds with no clear memory of what they contained. What Babylon leaves behind the word itself, Babylon, the word that traveled so far from the city that made it that it became something different, a symbol of corruption, a place of exile, the whore of Babylon in Revelation, the Babylon system in Rastafari. The fall of Babylon in prophetic tradition, the Babylon of Belshazzar's feast and the writing on the wall. All of these Babylons are real in their own way. They are the city's afterlife, the echo of its reputation moving through cultures and centuries and traditions that never saw the city and could not have, because the city was gone long before most of those traditions began. But the city itself was also real. The city itself was the blue Ishtar gate and the astronomical tables and the law code on its basalt steel and the merchants and the scribes and the priests of Marduk and the Jewish exiles sitting by the rivers of Babylon, weeping for Jerusalem in a city that was strange to them but real to someone. It was real. They were all real. What they leave behind a final reflection. You have visited 10 cities tonight. You started 10,000 years ago in Çatalhöyük, where people entered their houses through the ceiling and buried their dead under the floor and painted swallows on their walls 5,000 years before any of the other cities on this list existed. You visited Ur, the Sumerian city where writing and law and beer regulations and passive-aggressive business correspondence all began. You watched Mohenjo-daro build its drains with such care and precision that the technology would not be matched in most of the world for 2 millennia. You walked Teotihuacan's Avenue of the Dead with the nameless people who built the largest pyramid in the world by volume. You watched Carthage be erased so thoroughly that we still hear mostly about it through the voices of the people who erased it. You visited Palmyra's stone portrait gallery and tried to read the faces that looked back at you. You stood in Akrotiri as the bread cooled in the ovens that would never be lit again. You walked across the rooftops of Cahokia in the middle of the North American continent and wondered why you were never told about it. You watched tree roots swallow the faces of the Bayon at Angkor. You stood before the blue Ishtar gate of Babylon and felt small. What do these 10 cities, across 9,000 years, and every inhabited continent except Australia and Antarctica, have in common? They worked. For a while, they worked extraordinarily well. They gathered thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people in one place, fed them, gave them work, gave them meaning, gave them the social density that makes art and trade and learning and argument possible, and they did this for decades or centuries or in some cases millennia. And then they stopped working, always for reasons, never for the same reason twice, not entirely. Rivers moved, climates shifted, empires changed their priorities. Internal revolts burned the palaces of the powerful. Agricultural systems overextended themselves. Trade routes rerouted. New cities rose and old cities lost their demographic logic. Every one of these cities ended, and in almost every case the people did not end with them. They dispersed. They adapted. They carried with them, imperfectly, partially, transformed beyond recognition in some cases, pieces of the world those cities had made. The astronomical mathematics of Babylon ended up in Greek science, and from there in every piece of navigation and calendar and timekeeping that the modern world relies on. The agricultural techniques of Carthage ended up in the manuals of the people who destroyed Carthage. The ritual bathing traditions of the Indus Valley may have eventually become the sacred pools of the Hindu temple. The faces on the Pomeran funerary busts, specific and direct, looking at you from their limestone, are still looking at you in museums in London and Paris and Damascus and New York. The swallows of Akrotiri are still flying. History is not what happened. History is what survived. And what survived is always incomplete, always partial, always shaped by which civilizations had the resources and the interest to preserve, and which ones were unfortunate enough to be buried by ash or silt, or the sustained propaganda of their enemies. There are other cities we did not visit tonight. We could spend another 10 hours on Vijayanagara, the great medieval Hindu empire's capital in southern India, destroyed in a single day in 1565 by a coalition of Deccan sultans, and abandoned so suddenly that the markets were reportedly still full of goods when the sacking was done. We could visit Nan Madol, the city built on artificial islands off the coast of Pohnpei in the Pacific, constructed from basalt columns weighing up to 50 tons each on a coral reef, by a people who left no writing and whose methods of construction remain genuinely puzzling. We could visit Great Zimbabwe, the stone-walled city of the Shona people in southern Africa, which European colonists refused to believe was built by Africans and attributed to Phoenicians or Arabs or any other convenient explanation that preserved the myth of African pre-literate primitivism. We could visit Merv, the Central Asian city that was, at its 12th century peak, one of the largest cities in the world, then destroyed so completely by the Mongols in 1221 that its population, estimated at 1 million, was reduced to a few thousand survivors in a matter of days. We could go on. We will not tonight because you have been here for hours already, and because the point is not the catalogue. The point is the accumulation. The point is this. Human beings have been building cities for 10,000 years. We have been gathering in density, in complexity, in the productive friction of 1 million different people with 1 million different needs and skills and beliefs, and complaints living within walking distance of each other for 10,000 years. We built them in deserts and on river floodplains and on volcanic islands and in jungles and in the temperate forests of the North American continent. We built them out of mud brick and fired clay and granite and limestone and wood and earth. We oriented them by the stars. We dug their sewers with care. We painted swallows on their walls, and we lost them. We lost the names of the people who built them. We lost the languages they spoke. We lost most of their art, most of their literature, most of the specific, textured, irreducibly individual daily life that made these places real. But not all of it, not all of it. The ziggurat of Ur still stands in the Iraqi desert. The Ishtar Gate is in a museum in Berlin. The drains of Mohenjo-daro still run under the dirt of the Sind. The Avenue of the Dead is there, in the high plateau of central Mexico, waiting for the next person to walk its length in the early morning light. Monk's Mound is there. The tree-swallowed temples of Angkor are there. The swallows of Akrotiri are still flying. And every city that exists today, every urban center where you or anyone you know lives and works and argues with their neighbors and falls asleep to the sounds of a city that is, to them, simply home. Every one of those cities is the latest iteration of a 10,000-year human experiment in living together. The experiment continues. It is still going. It is going right now. That is the lost cities of the ancient world. 10 civilizations, 10 endings, and somewhere underneath all of it, 10 versions of the same story, people trying to make something that lasts. If you made it to the end of this one, I am genuinely grateful you spent this time here. Comments are open and I read every one of them. Tell me which city surprised you. Tell me which one you want to know more about. Tell me if you have been to any of these places, because if you have, I want to hear what it was like to stand there. If you are not subscribed and you find yourself here regularly, the button is right there. It takes 1 second and it is what keeps this channel alive. Next time on The Quiet Past, We are going somewhere I have been wanting to go for a very long time. I am not going to tell you where yet. But if you have ever wondered about the part of history that does not make it into the standard curriculum, about the stories that got left out because the people who experienced them did not have the resources to preserve them, you should probably stay close. Until then, sleep well. The past is not as far away as you think.